SpongeBob SquarePants has spent 25 years being called the most innocent cartoon on television. But the man who built Bikini Bottom told his writing room the entire surface world was dead, every explosion is shaped like a mushroom cloud, and 2 episodes show a main character waiting on a road to be killed by a bus. This is the dark lore of SpongeBob SquarePants, the quiet marine biologist who built an empire underwater. There is a photograph taken at the Ocean Institute in Dana Point, California, sometime in the mid-1980s. In it, a young man stands near a tide pool with a group of school children gathered around him. He is pointing at something in the water. The children are leaning in. Whatever he is showing them has their complete attention. The young man in the photograph is Steven Hillenburg, and at the time the picture was taken, he had no intention of ever making a cartoon. He was a marine biology teacher, and the ocean was the only thing he had ever really wanted to talk about. Stephen McDaniel Hillenburg was born on August 21, 1961, at Fort Sill, a United States Army post in Lawton, Oklahoma. His father worked for the military, and the family did not stay in Oklahoma long. When Stephen was still very young, they moved to Anaheim, California, where his father transitioned into a career as a draftsman and designer in the aerospace industry, and his mother taught students with visual impairments. The family settled into Southern California, and Stephen grew up with the coastline close by, the Pacific always within reach, and the beach culture of the area woven into his childhood in a way that would never fully leave him. He was a quiet child by most accounts. He liked drawing, he liked painting. He was deeply interested in the natural world, and his interests pulled him toward the water early and held him there. As a young teenager, he watched the films of Jacques Cousteau, the French oceanographer whose slow, narrated underwater documentaries about the seafloor and its creatures shaped a generation of kids who grew up wanting to know what lived below the surface. Hillenburg was one of those kids. Cousteau's voice, that slow and slightly formal French narration placed over footage of coral and fish and the deep dark blue of the ocean, stayed with Hillenburg for the rest of his life. Decades later, when SpongeBob SquarePants needed a narrator to open every episode, Hillenburg wrote the character as a direct homage to Cousteau. The French narrator, with his slow announcement that the show takes place somewhere under the sea near Bikini Bottom, is Cousteau's voice sitting inside the show, unchanged, every single time the opening plays. When Stephen was 15 years old, he went snorkeling for the first time. The dive took place on a school program at Woods Cove in Laguna Beach, and by his own description, something clicked. He later said it felt like a switch being thrown. The underwater world he had seen in Cousteau's films was suddenly real, and he was inside it, and whatever else he had been considering about his future narrowed down in that moment to one thing. He decided he wanted to be a marine biologist. He also kept drawing and painting, but marine science was the clear path, and he followed it north to Humboldt State University in Arcata, California, where he earned a degree in natural resource planning and interpretation with an emphasis on marine resources in 1984. After graduating, he returned to Southern California and took a job teaching marine biology at the Orange County Marine Institute in Dana Point, which is now known as the Ocean Institute. He taught there for several years, taking children to the tide pools along the coast and showing them what lived there: the crabs, the sea anemones, the starfish clinging to rocks, the small creatures that most people walk past without noticing. Hillenburg later said that working with children at the institute made him realize how genuinely fascinated young people were by the creatures of the ocean, especially the small invertebrates that lived in the tide pools. They were strange and real and almost alien, and children responded to them with an openness that adults had usually long since lost. It was during his years at the institute that one of the educational directors asked him to create a teaching tool. Hillenburg was already drawing and painting in his spare time, and the director thought a comic book about tide pool creatures might help students connect with the material. Hillenburg agreed and began working on something he called the intertidal zone. The comic featured anthropomorphic sea creatures, animals drawn with human characteristics, who lived and talked and had personalities rooted in the real behaviors and biology of the species Hillenburg knew well from his time in the water. The book was used in the classroom. Students responded to it. Hillenburg tried to get it published, approaching publishers with the project, but none of them took it on. The comic stayed a teaching tool, used at the institute, known only to the children who passed through the program. But inside the intertidal zone were characters: a sea sponge named Bob, a starfish, a crab, an octopus, a small green copepod. The drawings were rough compared to what they would eventually become, and the sponge looked like a real sea sponge rather than the square kitchen sponge the character would later be designed to resemble. The personalities, however, were already taking shape. The sponge was earnest and eager. The starfish was slow and simple. The crab was obsessed with money. The octopus was vain and frustrated. These were not random choices. Hillenburg was building something, even though he did not yet fully know what he was building or where it was going to go. His path toward animation began at one of the animation festivals he started attending during his years at the Institute. The International Tournée of Animation and Spike and Mike's Festival of Animation both screened short films from CalArts, the California Institute of the Arts in Valencia, and Hillenburg watched those films with growing attention. He had been interested in art his entire life. He had a painter's eye. He saw that what he was doing with the intertidal zone, the storytelling through drawing, the character building through visual detail, had more in common with animation than he had ever consciously recognized. In 1987, while still in his late 20s, he enrolled at CalArts to pursue a graduate degree in experimental animation. He had already spent years in a completely different field. He was starting over in the best possible way. At CalArts, Hillenburg came under the influence of Jules Engel, the founding director of the experimental animation program, who Hillenburg would later describe as his art dad. Engel was a painter and an animator, a figure who had worked on early Disney films and who spent the later part of his career at CalArts shaping a generation of animators who approached their work as fine art rather than as commercial product. Engel saw Hillenburg's paintings and his comic work and recognized a visual sensibility worth developing. He admitted Hillenburg into the program. Hillenburg graduated in 1992 with a Master of Fine Arts in Experimental Animation. In the same year, his thesis short film, Wormholes, a 7-minute animated piece built around the theory of relativity, won an award for Best Animated Concept at the Ottawa International Animation Festival and screened at festivals around the world. The short film opened doors. Hillenburg was offered a job on Rocko's Modern Life, a Nickelodeon animated series about a wallaby navigating the absurdities of modern life in a cartoon suburb. He worked on the show from 1993 to 1996, serving as a director and a writer, and the experience taught him the practical mechanics of producing an animated series for a network. He worked alongside people who shared his sensibility, including Joe Murray, who had created Rocko's Modern Life, and a group of writers and artists who approached children's animation with the same irreverence and detail that Hillenburg had always brought to everything he drew. During his years on Rocko's Modern Life, he kept returning to his tide pool characters. He kept refining them. He kept thinking about the world they lived in and what the show might actually be about. By 1994, he had begun developing the characters from the intertidal zone in a more formal way, working toward a pitch for a new series. The sea sponge had been renamed SpongeBoy, and the world had been moved underwater, beneath a specific real place on the map that Hillenburg had chosen on purpose and with full knowledge of its history. He spent 2 years developing the concept, the characters, the world, and the tone before he pitched it to Nickelodeon in 1998. The pitch was accompanied by a physical model of the underwater city, which Hillenburg had built himself. He brought a Hawaiian shirt to the pitch meeting. He played ukulele. The executives in the room were initially uncertain. One account from the period describes the Nickelodeon business team as responding to the concept with something close to alarm. A sponge, underwater, with a snail that meows, working in a restaurant shaped like a lobster trap. For children, there was one problem with the name SpongeBoy. A mop company had already trademarked it. Hillenburg had to rename the character, and the replacement name he landed on was SpongeBob. SpongeBob SquarePants, because the character's square shape was a deliberate visual choice rooted in the fact that kitchen sponges are square, and because the pants were a way of making the character immediately readable as a human-like figure, even though everything else about him was distinctly inhuman. The pilot episode was produced, and SpongeBob SquarePants premiered on Nickelodeon on May 1st, 1999. What happened next is one of those rare stories in children's television where the reception almost instantly exceeded what the creators had imagined. The show connected with children in a way that was expected, but it also connected with college students and with adults, who found in its humor and its strange visual logic something that worked on a completely different level from what the kids were watching. Within a very short time, SpongeBob SquarePants was the most watched program on Nickelodeon. It won Emmy Awards. It accumulated Kids' Choice Awards. The merchandise multiplied beyond anything Hillenburg had wanted or intended, and the multiplying merchandise was something he actively resisted for the rest of his life. He hated the commercialization of the show. He once told a colleague that his worst nightmare was finding a SpongeBob plush toy washed up on a beach like garbage. Hillenburg ran the show himself through its first 3 seasons, operating as showrunner with the kind of tight creative control that kept the show's voice consistent and its world coherent. He was present for almost every decision, from the design of backgrounds to the specific tone of individual lines of dialogue. Tom Kenny, the voice of SpongeBob, described working with Hillenburg as alternating between 2 modes. Some days, it was like doing math, precise and exact, with every vocal nuance already mapped out in Hillenburg's mind. Other days, it was like playing jazz, with Hillenburg telling his actors to take the material somewhere and see where it ended up. The combination produced something that felt both carefully designed and genuinely spontaneous. In 2004, Hillenburg directed the SpongeBob SquarePants movie movie, which he had originally intended to be the series finale. He designed the film as a conclusion, a proper ending for the characters and the world he had built. Nickelodeon had other plans. The network wanted more episodes, more seasons, more revenue from the most successful franchise in its history. Hillenburg disagreed. He stepped down as showrunner rather than continue producing a show he felt had reached its natural end. He handed the reins to Paul Tibbitt, who had been a key collaborator throughout the first 3 seasons, and Hillenburg moved away from the daily production of the show, remaining as an executive producer on paper, but no longer steering the ship. He spent the years after his departure making short films, returning to the smaller and more personal work he had been doing before Rocko's modern life changed his trajectory. He was not gone from SpongeBob entirely. He co-wrote the story for the second feature film, Sponge Out of Water, released in 2015, and returned to a more active role in the show's production during its later seasons, working on episodes that were released in some cases after his death. In March 2017, Hillenburg disclosed to Variety magazine that he had been diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, the neurodegenerative disease commonly known as ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. ALS destroys the neurons that control movement, gradually taking away a person's ability to walk, speak, swallow, and breathe, with no known cure. He was 55 years old at the time of the diagnosis. He told the magazine that he would continue working on SpongeBob SquarePants for as long as he was able, and he asked that his family's request for privacy be honored. He continued working. He came back to the show he had tried to end in 2004, contributing to it in whatever capacity he could for the time he had remaining. Steven Hillenburg died on November 26, 2018, in San Marino, California. He was 57 years old, a year and a half after his diagnosis had become public. Nickelodeon released a statement describing him as a beloved friend and longtime creative partner, and noting that the characters and world he created would long stand as a reminder of the value of optimism and the limitless power of imagination. Tom Kenny, the voice of the character that had made both of them famous, described Hillenburg's death as the loss of someone whose creative vision had shaped not just a show, but an entire way of seeing the underwater world. CalArts, where Hillenburg had earned the degree that changed his direction, called him a dear friend and noted that his ability to merge his passion for marine biology with his love of painting into a single world was something representative of everything the school hoped its students could become. The show he left behind did not stop. It had not stopped during his illness. It has not stopped since his death. SpongeBob SquarePants is now in its 16th season, has produced 4 feature films, a Broadway musical, a prequel series called Camp Coral, and spin-off programming that continues to expand the world Hillenburg built from a small comic book about tide pools. The franchise is estimated to be worth more than $15 billion. The plush toys have washed up on beaches. The character whose square shape was meant to evoke the humble kitchen sponge now appears on backpacks and birthday cakes and fast food packaging in every country where children watch television. Hillenburg had wanted children to look at tide pools more carefully. He wanted them to notice the crabs and the starfish and the plankton and feel some connection to the ocean. He hoped the show would make the sea feel like a place worth caring about. The show did something rather larger than that, and the man who made it spent his life slightly uncomfortable with how much larger it had become. The thing he built from his quiet love of the water turned into one of the most recognizable commercial properties in the history of children's entertainment. And underneath all of it, underneath the merchandise and the spin-offs and the theme park attractions, the world he designed was stranger and darker than almost any of the people who profited from it ever fully understood. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The man who built Bikini Bottom started with a tide pool comic and ended up designing a post-apocalyptic city without ever quite saying so out loud. The city he built has a very specific address on the real map of the world, and what happened at that address before the show ever existed is one of the darkest chapters in modern history. That is where the next section begins. Section 2, the birth of Bikini Bottom, and the city built on the end of the world, before a single frame of SpongeBob SquarePants was animated, before a single line of dialogue was recorded, before the theme song existed, or the Krusty Krab had a name. Steven Hillenburg made one decision that shaped everything. He chose a location, he picked a real place on the real map of the world, and decided that the fictional underwater city he was building would sit at the bottom of the sea, directly beneath it. The place he chose was Bikini Atoll, a coral reef in the Marshall Islands in the Central Pacific Ocean, and he did not choose it randomly. He chose it because he was a marine biologist who knew exactly what had happened there, and because the history of that place was dark enough and strange enough and specific enough to give the show an underground layer that most viewers would never consciously notice, but that Hillenburg felt needed to be there. The name Bikini Bottom is a pun. The atoll is called Bikini. The city is at the bottom of the sea beneath it. So, Bikini Bottom. The joke is light and simple on the surface, the kind of wordplay that makes a 7-year-old groan and an adult smile. But Hillenburg was not a man who made casual choices. Every element of the world he built had a reason behind it, and the location was no different. He was a marine biologist who had spent years teaching children about the ocean, and he knew the history of Bikini Atoll in detail. He knew it the way a person knows a place that matters, not just as a name on a map, but as a chapter of history with real consequences that are still being felt by real people today. Bikini Atoll is made up of 23 small islands arranged in a rough oval shape around a central lagoon in the Marshall Islands. It is a real place. It still exists. The islands are low and flat, covered with coconut palms, and the lagoon at the center is one of the clearest bodies of water in the Pacific. Before 1946, roughly 167 people lived there. They had lived there for generations, fishing the lagoon, growing food, maintaining the rhythms of a life built around a small and specific piece of the world that was entirely theirs. Their name for themselves was Bikinians, and the name of their homeland was their identity in the most complete sense. The land and the people were the same thing. In 1946, the United States government asked them to leave. The request was delivered by Commodore Ben Wyatt, the American military governor of the Marshall Islands, who told the Bikinian leader, a man named King Judah, that the United States needed to use the atoll for the good of mankind and for the purpose of ending all wars. The language was large, and the implication was clear. The Bikinians were being asked to give up their home so that the United States could test nuclear weapons there. King Judah consulted with his people. He then told Wyatt that the Bikinians were willing to go, comparing their situation to that of the children of Israel, who had also been asked to leave their home in trust that things would work out. It was an act of faith. It was also the beginning of a displacement that has never ended. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated 67 nuclear weapons across the Marshall Islands, with 23 of those detonations taking place specifically at Bikini Atoll. The tests included Operation Crossroads in 1946, which was the first time nuclear weapons had ever been detonated underwater. The Baker test, one of the two shots in Operation Crossroads, was detonated 60 feet below the surface of the lagoon on July 25, 1946, and produced a distinctive column of water and steam that rose from the surface before collapsing into a mushroom cloud visible from miles away. Photographs of the Baker test are among the most widely reproduced images of the nuclear age. The shape of the explosion, the column rising and then the cloud spreading outward at the top, is a shape that anyone who has seen a nuclear test photograph will recognize immediately. The largest of all the tests at Bikini came in 1954. On March 1st of that year, the United States detonated a device called Castle Bravo on the surface of the reef. Castle Bravo was a hydrogen bomb, the most powerful weapon the United States had ever tested at the time, and the explosion was significantly larger than the scientists who designed it had predicted. The yield was approximately 15 megatons, which made it roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. The blast vaporized 3 of the reef islands entirely. The fireball reached more than 4 miles across. The mushroom cloud rose to a height of approximately 60,000 feet and spread to a width of 62 miles. Radioactive fallout drifted across thousands of square miles of ocean and reached inhabited atolls where people who had not been warned were exposed to radiation. The Bikinians who had been relocated to Rongerik Atoll and other islands in the region were affected. So were the crews of fishing vessels in the area, including a Japanese tuna boat called the Lucky Dragon, whose 23 crew members were all exposed to the fallout, and one of whom died from radiation sickness months later. The Bikinians never went home. After being moved from their homeland to Rongerik in 1946, they faced near starvation almost immediately because Rongerik did not have the food sources they needed to survive. They were moved to Kwajalein, then to Kili Island. In 1968, the United States government told them it was safe to return to Bikini. Some families did return. Within a decade, studies revealed that the radiation levels in the soil, the water, and the food grown on the island were still dangerously high. The returnees were evacuated again in 1978. They have not been back. The land is still considered too contaminated for permanent human habitation. The radiation in the coconut crabs, the fruit, and the soil remains elevated. Every March 1st, the Marshall Islands observe a National Day of Remembrance on the anniversary of the Castle Bravo detonation, and school children across the country gather to mark what happened to their ancestors and to the land that was taken from them. This is the real place that Steven Hillenburg chose to put his cartoon city underneath. For years, the connection was treated by the show's production team as an open secret that they were not fully willing to confirm. The fan community had been discussing the Bikini Atoll theory for a long time, pointing to visual evidence in the show and to the obvious logic of the location. Fans on Reddit and YouTube had built detailed arguments for the theory as early as 2015, noting the specific shape of the explosions in the show, the design of the buildings in Bikini Bottom, and the strange biology of its residents as evidence that the city was meant to be be understood as the survivor of a nuclear catastrophe. The theory was widely discussed but remained officially unconfirmed until December 2024. In December 2024, Esquire magazine published a reunion video featuring the main voice cast of SpongeBob SquarePants. The cast members gathered to discuss the show and its history, and one of them, Roger Bumpass, who voices Squidward, brought up the Bikini Atoll theory. Bumpass said he had been telling fans for years that the nuclear connection was not true, that the name was just a pun and nothing more. Mr. Lawrence, the longtime writer of the show and the voice of Plankton, was sitting beside him. He immediately corrected Bumpass. Mr. Lawrence said yes, the connection was true. It was absolutely part of the show's design. Bumpass looked surprised. He said he had been denying it for years. Mr. Lawrence confirmed again that it was true and that the connection had always been part of the fun of designing the show. Then Mr. Lawrence said something that pushed the implications further than the fan theory had ever quite gone. He said that, in the very first season, the writing room had asked themselves how far they were going to take the concept. The original idea, he said, was that the whole world was dead except for Bikini Bottom. The voice actor Bill Fagerbach, who plays Patrick, asked whether the muffler-shaped houses in the show were connected to that concept. Mr. Lawrence said yes. The world upstairs, he said, was gone, and Bikini Bottom was what remained. The muffler houses are one of the most distinctive visual details in Bikini Bottom. Many of the residential buildings in the show are constructed from old car mufflers, the exhaust pipes from automobiles. Viewed in the context of Mr. Lawrence's statement, the implication is that the surface world ended in a nuclear war, and that the debris from that world sank to the ocean floor over time, where the mutated survivors of the catastrophe used it as building material. The car mufflers came from cars on the surface. The anchors used as lampposts came from ships that sank when civilization collapsed. The diving helmets that appear as mailboxes in some episodes belong to human explorers from the world that no longer exists. The Easter Island head that serves as Squidward's home is a piece of human cultural history from a civilization that is gone. This also explains, retroactively, the shape of every explosion in the show. In SpongeBob SquarePants, every time something blows up, the explosion takes the form of a mushroom cloud. The Krusty Krab kitchen blows up, and the cloud rises in that distinctive shape. Plankton's inventions explode, and the cloud forms at the top. The shape repeats throughout the show, across hundreds of episodes, and while most viewers register it as a cartoon convention, fans who knew the Bikini Atoll theory had been pointing to it for years as evidence that the shape was deliberate. The episode called Dying for Pie contains an explosion that a number of researchers have noted closely resembles the actual photographic documentation of the Baker test from 1946, the underwater detonation that produced the distinctive column and cloud shape that became one of the defining images of the nuclear age. Every time something explodes in Bikini Bottom, the show is, in its quiet way, drawing the same picture. The biology of the show's residents also makes sense through this frame. Sea sponges do not talk. Starfish do not attend boating school. Crabs do not run restaurants. Octopi do not play clarinet. Squirrels from Texas do not live in air domes on the ocean floor. None of these things happen in the real ocean. They happen in Bikini Bottom because, according to the original concept of the show, the genetic structure of every species in the area has been permanently altered by the radiation from 67 nuclear weapons. The fish walk and talk because their ancestors were changed by fallout. The biology of the entire underwater city is the biology of survival after catastrophe, expressed through the visual language of a children's cartoon. The city of Rock Bottom, which appears in a second season episode of the same name, sits even deeper beneath Bikini Bottom and is home to even stranger and more unsettling creatures. The fan theory, before it was confirmed, identified Rock Bottom as the literal blast crater left behind by one of the Bikini Atoll detonations, a depression in the ocean floor where the explosion went deepest and the radiation was most concentrated. The creatures who live in Rock Bottom are more alien in appearance than the residents of Bikini Bottom proper, their biology pushed further by more intense exposure. The show treats Rock Bottom as a place to be feared, somewhere SpongeBob and Patrick stumble into by accident and struggle to escape from. Viewed through the post-nuclear frame, the reason for that fear becomes something more specific than just visual strangeness. Hillenburg's decision to ground the show's world in this specific real history was consistent with everything else he brought to his work. He was a marine biologist before he was an animator, and marine biologists do not build worlds casually. Every choice in the design of Bikini Bottom reflects a mind that was thinking about what the ocean actually contains, what actually lives there, and what the presence of 67 nuclear weapons in the Central Pacific would actually have done to the ecosystem at the bottom of the sea. The cheerful surface of the show, the bright colors, and the slapstick humor, and the theme song about a sponge and a pineapple sits on top of a foundation that Hillenburg designed with full awareness of what it was built on. Most viewers never look down. The children watching the show show, see the pineapple and the Krusty Krab and SpongeBob's enormous eyes and laugh. The adults watching alongside them see the same things and laugh too. The history underneath all of it, the displaced people and the contaminated land and the 67 explosions and the world that ended before the show ever began, stays quiet and invisible. Exactly where Hillenburg put it. There is a small detail about the show's opening sequence that sits differently once the post-nuclear reading is in place. The French narrator, the Cousteau homage, opens every episode by establishing where the story takes place. His voice is calm and slow and slightly formal, like someone narrating a nature documentary. He says that somewhere out in the Pacific Ocean, far below the surface, there is a place called Bikini Bottom. He says it the same way every time, in the same unhurried tone, as if announcing something simple and pleasant. The city is real, the world above is gone. The narrator describes the surviving city the way a documentarian might describe a natural wonder, with no indication that the name of the place carries anything heavier than a pun. That is, in the end, what the best layer of the show's world design does. It carries its history quietly, in the name, in the shapes of the explosions, in the mufflers used as walls and the anchors used as lampposts, in the strange biology of talking animals and sentient houses. The show never announces any of it. It just puts it there, underneath everything, and lets the world sit on top of it. Steven Hillenburg built the city, confirmed its dark foundation to almost no one, and then spent 25 years watching children fall in love with the survivors. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Bikini Bottom sits on the ruins of a world that ended before the first episode ever aired, and the man who designed it left clues in every explosion and every muffler-shaped house. But the city itself is only one layer of the show's hidden architecture. The building at the center of it, the one every character orbits around, has an origin story darker and stranger than most fans realize. That is where the next section begins. Section 3, the Krusty Krab, the Krabby Patty, and the friendship that built both. There is a building in Bikini Bottom that every character in the show treats as the center of the world. The residents line up outside it. They argue about it. They dream about it. Plankton has spent decades trying to destroy it from across the street. SpongeBob has built his entire identity around working inside it. Squidward has spent his career resenting it. Mr. Krabs has organized his whole life around owning it. The Krusty Krab is not just a restaurant. It is the gravitational center of Bikini Bottom, the place everything else orbits, and its origin story is one of the quietest and most carefully constructed pieces of writing the show has ever produced. Most viewers know the Krusty Krab as the place SpongeBob works. They know the counter, the fryer, the dining room with its mismatched chairs, the manager's office where Mr. Krabs counts his money, and the kitchen where the Krabby Patties are made. The building is visually familiar to anyone who watched the show as a child. What most viewers never fully registered is the shape of the building itself, because the shape is a joke that only works if you know enough marine biology to get it. The Krusty Krab is built to look like a wooden lobster trap. It has the curved roof, the wooden slats, the specific door shape, the general silhouette of a trap sitting on the ocean floor. Mr. Krabs is a crab. The building named after him, the restaurant he owns, is a structure designed to catch and hold creatures like him. Every customer who walks through the door is walking willingly into a trap named after their predator, to eat food named after the same predator, and they line up to do it. Hillenburg designed this on purpose. He was a marine biologist. The joke is silent, and it runs through every single episode. The history of how the building came to exist is revealed in one of the most beloved episodes of the show's third season, a piece called the Krusty Krab Training Video, which aired in May 2002. The episode is structured as a workplace orientation film, narrated in the flat, slightly condescending tone of an industrial training video from the 1980s. The narrator, voiced by a guest actor named Steve Kahela, walks a new employee through the history and operations of the Krusty Krab as if reading from a corporate manual. The information delivered in this framing is treated as mundane, as ordinary workplace background, but the details are anything but ordinary. According to the training video, the building was not built to be a restaurant. It was originally a retirement home called the Rusty Krab, which had gone out of business and been left empty. Mr. Krabs, who had recently returned from serving in the military and was going through what the narrator describes as a deep, seemingly endless depression, eventually purchased the abandoned building and converted it into a restaurant. The episode shows him during this period, sitting alone in a darkened room, a bottle visible on a nightstand, looking exhausted. Then it shows him slowly beginning to rebuild, painting the sign, constructing the menu, opening the doors for the first time. It is one of the most restrained and genuinely moving passages in the entire show, a portrait of a person pulling himself out of a very dark place through the act of building something, slipped inside a comedy episode about how to operate a cash register. The detail about Mr. Krabs serving in the military is confirmed elsewhere in the show. His rank is given in various episodes as a naval officer, and his service is treated as a real part of his backstory rather than a throwaway detail. The exact nature of what he experienced during his service, the specific reasons for the depression the training video references, are never fully spelled out. The show leaves it quiet, which is consistent with the way the best moments of SpongeBob's early seasons worked. The darkness is real, it is acknowledged. It is then set aside and covered over with the bright colors and the comedy, the way the actual world often covers its darkest corners with the most ordinary-looking surfaces. The food the Krusty Krab sells is the Krabby Patty, and the secret behind the patty is the longest-running mystery the show has ever maintained. The recipe is kept in a small glass bottle sealed with a cork, with the formula written on a piece of paper rolled up inside it. The bottle is stored in a safe behind the manager's desk. In the episode Plankton's Army, Squidward casually mentions that the bottle is sometimes kept under Mr. Krabs' mattress at home, suggesting the formula moves around depending on how threatened Mr. Krabs feels. In the episode Friendiversary, a detail is revealed that reframes the formula's security in an unexpected way. SpongeBob is the only person who knows the combination to the safe. He keeps the combination tied to a specific memory from one of his earliest experiences with Squidward. When that memory is erased, SpongeBob forgets the combination, and the formula is briefly inaccessible even to the people who own it. The recipe is, in a very practical sense, locked inside SpongeBob's emotional life. What the recipe contains is something the show has been deliberately vague about since the beginning. Stephen Hillenburg made a specific decision about the formula very early on that has shaped how every writer has handled it for more than 25 years. He decided the Krabby Patty would contain no meat of any kind. The longtime producer and animator Vincent Waller, who has been involved with the show across most of its run, has confirmed this in multiple statements. The writer Mr. Lawrence, who voices Plankton, has confirmed the same thing. The show's internal rules treat fish as people, not as food, and the patty was designed from the beginning to be consistent with that rule. Hillenburg conceived of it as a vegetable-based burger. The writers are not allowed, in most contexts, to depict fish being eaten as food. The entire culture of Bikini Bottom treats fish as sentient beings, and the food chain that would apply to real ocean life is essentially suspended. This created a particular frustration for fans in 2024 when Wendy's announced a promotional partnership built around the Krabby Patty brand using the chain's beef burger. The collaboration placed the SpongeBob name on a product that directly contradicted the canon Hillenburg had spent decades maintaining. Hillenburg had died in 2018 and was not alive to object. Fans who knew the show's canon objected on his behalf, pointing out that the real Krabby Patty, by the explicit creative rules Hillenburg had established, contains no animal product whatsoever, making a beef-based Krabby Patty a contradiction in terms. What ingredients the patty does contain has been confirmed in fragments across many episodes. In the episode The Great Patty Caper, 3 ingredients are identified: flour, barnacle shavings, and turmeric. In SpongeBob on Parade, salt is named as one of the components. In the episode Krabby Road, the formula is briefly visible on screen, but the ingredients are written in deliberate gibberish, impossible to decode. Vincent Waller confirmed in a public reply that the gibberish was intentional, written specifically so that no audience member could ever extract a real recipe from the image. The writers do not want the secret solved. They have never wanted it solved. The mystery is structural to the show. The formula's power comes from its secrecy, and the moment it is revealed, the show loses something it can never get back. So the gibberish stays, the bottle stays sealed, the safe stays locked. SpongeBob holds the combination in his memory, and the recipe remains, after 25 years, unknown. The Krabby Patty's strange properties go beyond its ingredients. The episode Just One Bite reveals the existence of a patty vault inside the Krusty Krab, a room containing a massive stockpile of Krabby Patties piled from floor to ceiling, which Mr. Krabs maintains as a reserve for reasons the episode does not fully explain. The same episode also reveals that the patties are, to some degree, addictive. Squidward, who has spent years insisting he hates them, eats one and immediately loses control, sneaking into the restaurant in the middle of the night to consume dozens of them, only to be caught by the security system. The show treats the addiction as comedy, but the implication is persistent. There is something in the Krabby Patty that creates a compulsive desire to eat more of them. The first film treats the patty as so essential to Bikini Bottom's social order that when the recipe is stolen and the patties stop being made, the city descends into chaos within days. The second film returns to the same idea, with Mr. Krabs declaring that civilization itself depends on the formula remaining inside the restaurant. The origin of the formula, and the story of how the Krusty Krab came to be built at all, is the deepest piece of established history the show has ever produced. It was revealed in a single episode, the season 5 premiere called Friend or Foe, which aired on April 13, 2007. The episode is structured as a flashback triggered by yet another failed attempt by Plankton to steal the secret formula. formula. SpongeBob asks Mr. Krabs why he and Plankton hate each other so much. Mr. Krabs sits down with an expression the show rarely gives him, something heavy and honest, and for the first time in the show's history, tells the truth about where everything began. Mr. Krabs and Plankton, according to friend or foe, were born on the same day in the same hospital. They grew up together in Bikini Bottom. They were inseparable as children, both of them outcasts, both of them picked on by the same bullies. Plankton was bullied for being scientifically gifted, which his peers read as arrogance. Mr. Krabs was bullied for being desperately poor, his family having almost nothing. The two of them found in each other the only friendship either of them had, and that friendship was real. It sustained both of them through years of being the kids that nobody else wanted around. As teenagers, they decided to go into business together. They pooled everything they had, which between them was nearly nothing, and rented the back room of a local grocery store run by a fish named Old Man Jenkins, intending to sell burgers. Their first attempt at a recipe failed so badly that Old Man Jenkins, who ate the test patty, was knocked unconscious. The two of them fled, and in their panic, dropped the recipe they had been working on. The paper landed in a garbage can. As it fell, it picked up other materials from the trash, mixing with whatever was in the can. Mr. Krabs retrieved the paper. He and Plankton each grabbed a corner. The paper tore. Plankton ended up with a fragment so small it was essentially useless. Mr. Krabs ended up with the larger piece, the one with enough of the formula to work from. What happened next ended the friendship. The full details of the split are left slightly ambiguous by the episode, which tells the story from multiple perspectives and acknowledges that memory is not always accurate. What is clear is that Plankton felt cheated, that Mr. Krabs used the formula he had taken to build the Krusty Krab and become successful, and that Plankton was left with nothing. The decades of attempts to steal the formula, which the show presents in almost every episode as the central comic conflict of the series, are rooted in something that is not comic at all. Plankton is not simply a villain trying to steal a burger recipe. He is a man who believes, with some justification, that what Mr. Krabs built was built with something that was partly his. The joke of Plankton failing to steal the formula, repeated across hundreds of episodes and 4 feature films, sits on top of a story about a friendship destroyed by money and pride and a piece of paper that tore in the wrong place. The show rarely returns to this layer. It is easier and funnier to keep Plankton as the hapless villain whose schemes always fail, and the show is almost always a comedy, but the backstory exists. Friend or foe put it in the record, and it cannot be taken out. Every time Plankton schemes and fails and retreats to the chum bucket, the empty restaurant across the street, the failure carries the weight of that original split. He was there when the formula was created. He had a hand in making it. He ended up with a scrap. The man across the street built his whole life on what they made together, and Plankton has spent every day since trying to get back what he believes was taken from him. The chum bucket itself is the dark mirror image of the Krusty Krab. Where the Krusty Krab is successful, warm, and busy, the chum bucket is empty, cold, and failing. The food Plankton sells is, by all accounts within the show, genuinely terrible. No one eats there voluntarily. The restaurant has had essentially no customers across the entire run of the series. Plankton lives there with his wife Karen, who is a waterproof computer he built himself, and who is one of the most unexpectedly layered characters in the show. Karen is sarcastic and sardonic, and often more strategically intelligent than Plankton, and her relationship with him is complicated in ways the show occasionally acknowledges and then quickly retreats from. She enables his obsession. She participates in his schemes. She also, in moments scattered across the series, seems to genuinely care about him and to be the only thing in his life that is not defined by his failure. The formula itself, the secret at the center of everything, remains sealed in its bottle, locked in its safe, protected by a combination that only SpongeBob knows. The show has maintained this mystery for over 25 years. The writers have made it clear, through their deliberate use of gibberish and their refusal to ever fully name the ingredients, that they intend to maintain it for however long the show continues to run. The secret formula is not a story that ends. It is the engine the show runs on, the thing that keeps Plankton scheming and Mr. Krabs protecting and SpongeBob cooking, and the engine works precisely because it never quite runs out of fuel. He knew it the way he knew the lobster trap shape of the building and the post-apocalyptic history of the city the building stood in. He built a mystery and sealed it shut, and the seal has held. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Krusty Krab was built on an old retirement home. The formula was born from a torn piece of paper and a broken friendship, and the patty vault sits inside a building shaped like a trap. But the architecture of the show's dark interior goes beyond the buildings. The characters themselves were designed with a hidden layer, one that the cast confirmed on camera in 2024, and that changes the way every scene in the show can be read. That is where the next section goes. Section 4. The 7 Deadly Sins, the mental disorders, and the dark design of the characters. Most people who watched SpongeBob SquarePants as children remember the characters as a collection of funny personalities. The eager sponge, the dim starfish, the grumpy octopus, the greedy crab, the scheming plankton, the tough squirrel, the penny-pinching boss. They work as comic types, instantly recognizable, easy to summarize in a single word. What most people did not know, and what the cast confirmed on camera at a reunion event in late 2024, is that the characters were built on a framework much older and much darker than a children's cartoon has any obvious reason to use. The 7 deadly sins of Christian theology, pride, greed, lust, envy, wrath, sloth, and gluttony, were woven into the design of the main cast from the very beginning, not as a message, not as a sermon, but as a structural skeleton that gave each character a defining internal logic that never needed to be explained out loud. The confirmation came during a cast reunion video published by Esquire magazine in December 2024. The voice cast had gathered to discuss the show and its history, and someone raised the 7 deadly sins theory, which had been circulating in fan communities and academic discussions for years. Roger Bumpass, the voice of Squidward, acknowledged the connection between certain characters and their corresponding sins. Mr. Lawrence, the writer and voice of Plankton, addressed the theory directly. He explained that while the mapping was not as rigid as a strict one-to-one assignment, the characters almost certainly had individual distinctions rooted in the sins. The framework was part of the show's design, even if it was never formally announced, and even if the writers themselves applied it with varying degrees of deliberateness across different seasons. The clearest connections are the ones that require the least explanation. Mr. Krabs and greed are essentially synonymous. The character is defined by his relationship to money in a way that goes beyond personality quirk into something closer to a consuming compulsion. He has nightmares about refunds. He becomes visibly agitated at the thought of spending money on anything that cannot be directly converted back into profit. He has, in various episodes, attempted to charge SpongeBob for the air inside the Krusty Krab, sold SpongeBob's soul to the Flying Dutchman for pocket change, and expressed more genuine grief over the loss of a single coin than over any harm done to a person. In the episode Selling Out, he literally sings about the power of greed with the enthusiasm of a revival preacher. The sin is not a subtext for Mr. Krabs. It is the text. Patrick and Sloth are equally clear. Patrick Star lives under a rock, which is both his literal address and a fairly direct visual metaphor for withdrawal from the world. He sleeps for long stretches. He has no job, no ambitions, no projects, and no apparent awareness that any of this might be unusual. In the episode Big Pink Loser, he receives an award for doing nothing the longest and treats it as a straightforward achievement rather than a joke at his expense. His lack of urgency about everything, including emergencies, is one of the show's most reliable comic sources. The sloth is not performed. It is simply Patrick's relationship with existence, and the show presents it without judgment and without resolution across hundreds of episodes. Patrick is not going to change. The rock will always be there when he wants to sleep again. Squidward and Wrath are slightly more complex because Squidward's anger is inseparable from his disappointment. He is not simply an angry character. He is a character who believes he deserves more than he has, who has been passed over by the world he feels entitled to, and whose anger is the direct expression of that gap between what he expected and what he received. He hates SpongeBob not because SpongeBob has done anything wrong, but because SpongeBob's cheerfulness is a constant reminder that the world Squidward lives in is not the world he imagined for himself. The wrath is personal. It is aimed at everything around him because everything around him is evidence of his failure to become the artist, the musician, the recognized genius he was certain he was going to be. Plankton and envy complete the most obvious grouping. Plankton's entire existence is organized around wanting what Mr. Krabs has. The secret formula is not valuable to him primarily as a recipe. It is valuable as a symbol of the success he was denied, the life that split away from him when the paper tore and he ended up with the smaller piece. Every scheme to steal the formula is, underneath the comedy, an expression of envy so total that it has consumed every other aspect of his life. He has a wife. He has a laboratory. He has, in theory, an entire existence that has nothing to do with Mr. Krabs. He cannot access any of it because envy of Mr. Krabs has taken up all the available space. Sandy Cheeks and Pride present a more layered case. Sandy is brilliant, physically capable, scientifically accomplished, and aware of all of it. She has crossed an ocean alone to live in a dome on the ocean floor in order to conduct research, which is not the behavior of someone who lacks confidence. Her pride in her Texas roots, her scientific achievements, and her physical strength is a running thread throughout the show. The pride is not portrayed as a flaw in the way it might be in a morality tale. Sandy is genuinely as capable as she believes herself to be, which makes her pride technically accurate, which is its own kind of problem. The sin works best as a category when the pride exceeds the reality. In Sandy's case, the pride and the reality are roughly aligned, which is either a subtle joke joke about the nature of pride, or simply the result of a character whose competence was more useful to the show's plots than her potential humiliation would have been. SpongeBob and lust is the assignment that confuses people most, because lust is most commonly understood in a romantic or sexual sense, and SpongeBob as a romantic figure is not a reading the show encourages. The lust in SpongeBob's character is better understood as an excess of desire in a more general sense, an overwhelming wanting that attaches itself to everything around him. He wants to be the best fry cook. He wants Patrick to be his best friend. He wants Squidward to like him. He wants to pass his boating exam. He wants to please Mr. Krabs. He wants Gary to be fed and happy. The wanting never stops. His enthusiasm for every experience, his inability to be satisfied with simply existing quietly, his compulsive need to do more and feel more and connect more is the engine that drives almost every plot the show has ever produced. In the Esquire reunion, Tom Kenny, his voice actor, acknowledged the assignment with some amusement, noting that SpongeBob's lust really does express itself most clearly as a desire to work more at the Krusty Krab, which is both the funniest and the most accurate version of the reading. Gary the Snail and Gluttony complete the 7. Gary's primary expressed desire across the entire series is food. His relationship with SpongeBob is warm and real, but it is consistently expressed through the language of feeding. When Gary is unhappy, he is most often unhappy because he has not been fed. When he is content, he is most often content because he has. His meowing, which is his only form of communication, has been translated in various episodes as essentially always being about food in one way or another. The gluttony is quiet, domestic, and feline, which makes it the most charming of the 7 sins as the show deploys them, but it is there. What makes the 7 deadly sins framework interesting as a piece of design is not that it makes the show darker, because the show does not feel like a theological document when you watch it. What makes it interesting is that it explains why the characters never change. In a show where continuity is loose and character development is essentially non-existent across the series, the 7 sins give each character a fixed internal gravity. Mr. Krabs cannot stop being greedy because greed is not his personality, it is his category. Patrick cannot become ambitious because sloth is not a phase he is going through. Squidward cannot make peace with his life because wrath sustained by disappointment is the organizing principle of his entire existence. The sins are not flaws the characters might overcome, they are the shapes the characters were poured into, and the shapes are permanent. Running alongside the 7 deadly sins theory is a second and separate reading that the show's cast also engaged with at the 2024 Esquire reunion, one that gained significant online traction in early 2023 after a TikTok video explaining it accumulated close to 30 million views. This second framework maps each main character not onto a theological sin, but onto a mental health condition. SpongeBob is read as having ADHD, given his difficulty with sustained attention on things he is not passionate about, his impulsivity, his extreme emotional reactivity, and his capacity for hyperfocus when something genuinely interests him. Patrick is read as representing an intellectual disability, given his profound difficulty with abstract reasoning, cause and effect, and the basic logic of social situations. Squidward is read as clinically depressed, his cynicism and withdrawal and creative frustration mapping onto the behavioral profile of someone for whom low mood is not occasional but structural. Tom Kenny, SpongeBob's voice actor, addressed the question of his character's neurology at the 2024 Motor City Comic-Con, where he said he personally considers SpongeBob to be autistic. Kenny did not present this as the official position of the show's creators, but as his own interpretation of the character he has voiced for over 25 years. His reasoning centered on SpongeBob's intense and specific enthusiasms, his difficulty reading social cues in certain contexts, his need for routine, and the genuine sincerity with which he engages with a world that frequently does not engage back with the same sincerity. Kenny's reading is one actor's interpretation, not canonical fact, but it is the interpretation of the person who has spent more time inside the character's voice than anyone else alive, which gives it a particular kind of weight. Mr. Krabs in the mental disorder framework is most often assigned narcissistic personality disorder, given his inability to consider the well-being of others when it conflicts with his own desires, his grandiose self-image, and his genuine difficulty understanding why people find his behavior troubling. Plankton draws bipolar disorder in many versions of the reading, given the cycling between grandiose schemes and crushing defeats, the periods of wild confidence followed by complete collapse. Mrs. Puff, SpongeBob's long-suffering boating instructor, is most often read as having post-traumatic stress disorder, given that she has been through hundreds of boat crashes caused by SpongeBob, has been hospitalized multiple times as a result, and reacts to SpongeBob's presence with a dread that the show depicts as genuine and deep rather than comedic exaggeration. What is important about both frameworks frameworks, the 7 sins and the mental disorder theory, is that neither of them was designed to make the show feel disturbing. They were, to the extent they were consciously applied, structural tools for building characters who would be immediately readable, consistently funny, and internally consistent across a very long run. A character defined by a sin or a condition does not need to be explained every episode. The audience understands who they are from a single scene, and that understanding holds. The darkness in the design is not the point. The point is that the design works, and the darkness is simply what you find when you look at why it works. The fan community has extended both frameworks in directions the show's creators almost certainly did not anticipate. The mental disorder readings have led to detailed online analyses treating individual episodes as case studies in the symptomology of specific conditions, with screenshots and scene breakdowns assembled as evidence. The 7 sins readings have generated arguments about which character belongs to which sin that have been running on forums and comment sections since at least 2007 and show no signs of concluding. The show generated a world specific and detailed enough that the fans found their own ways into it and have been living there ever since. Underneath both readings is a simpler and perhaps more honest observation. Steven Hillenburg built characters who were funny because they were broken in very specific ways, and the brokenness was precise enough that it mapped onto frameworks humans have used for centuries to categorize the ways people go wrong. The sins and the conditions are different vocabularies for the same thing, the predictable shapes that human failure tends to take, and Hillenburg, whether deliberately or instinctively, built his cast from those shapes. The result is a group of characters who are always funny and occasionally heartbreaking, depending on how closely the viewer decides to look. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The characters were built on a framework of sins and broken minds, designed to be funny and quietly precise about the ways people fail. But the darkest structural layer of the show is not in its characters. It is in the world they inhabit, and in a confirmation that arrived in 2024 that changed the way the post-nuclear reading of Bikini Bottom has to be understood. The next section walks through what Mr. Lawrence said on camera, what it means for every explosion in the show's history, and what rock bottom actually is. Section 5, the post-apocalyptic truth beneath the show. Something changed in December 2024, not in the show itself, not in the archive of episodes, or the streaming catalog, or the merchandise that fills the shelves of toy stores in every country where children watch television. What changed was the official record, a piece of information that the production team had been carrying quietly for over 25 years, moved from the category of fan theory into the category of confirmed fact, and it moved there in the most casual way imaginable, during a reunion video published by a magazine, between 2 voice actors sitting next to each other in a room, one of them correcting the other in the tone of someone clarifying something that should have been obvious all along. Roger Bumpass had been telling fans for years that the Bikini Atoll connection was nothing, just a name, a geographic pun, clever but shallow, meaning nothing beyond the surface wordplay. He said this at conventions and in interviews and in the casual conversations that voice actors have with fans who ask about the show they have spent decades working on. He believed it. He had no particular reason not to believe it. Then he said it on camera, in front of Mr. Lawrence, who turned to him with the expression of someone who has just heard something incorrect said in public and feels an obligation to fix it. Mr. Lawrence, who has written for the show since its first season and who voices Plankton, said no. The connection was real. It had always been real. The name was chosen because of the history, not despite it, and the history was woven into the show's design from the very beginning. Bumpass absorbed this and said, with what sounded like genuine surprise, that he had been giving fans the wrong answer for years. The exchange lasted perhaps 30 seconds. The confirmation it contained had been sitting inside the show for over 2 decades. What Mr. Lawrence confirmed extended well past the name. He described a conversation from the show's first season, a question the writing room had put to itself about how far the concept was going to go. The answer they landed on was further than anyone outside the room had ever quite realized. The original idea, Mr. Lawrence said plainly, was that the whole world was dead. The surface was gone. Human civilization had ended, and what existed at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean beneath a nuclear test site was all that remained of any organized life on Earth. Bikini Bottom is not a cheerful underwater city that happens to share a name with a contaminated atoll. Bikini Bottom is what survived after everything above it was destroyed. Bill Fagerbakke, the voice of Patrick, heard this and immediately asked about the houses. The buildings in Bikini Bottom, constructed from car mufflers, the exhaust components of automobiles, had always been one of the show's more distinctive visual details. Fagerbakke wanted to know if those were part of the post-apocalyptic concept. Mr. Lawrence said yes. The mufflers fell from the surface when civilization ended. The anchors that serve as street furniture came from ships that sank in the same collapse. The diving helmets repurposed repurposed as mailboxes, belonged to human explorers from a species that no longer exists above the waterline. The residents of Bikini Bottom did not choose these materials from a catalog. They used what the dead world dropped on them. The implications of this confirmation reach into every corner of the show's visual design. The fire hydrants standing on street corners in Bikini Bottom came from a road system that no one uses anymore. The wooden ship wheels that appear as decorative elements in various buildings were salvaged from vessels that went down when the surface world did. The television sets and picture frames and household objects that appear in characters' homes are the preserved remnants of a material culture that ceased to exist before the first episode aired. Every time a background detail in Bikini Bottom looks like something from the human world, it is something from the human world. It fell there. The people who live underneath picked it up and built their city from it. This reframes the opening sequence of every episode in a specific way. The French narrator, who is Hillenburg's homage to Jacques Cousteau, delivered in the unhurried cadence of a nature documentary, announces each episode by establishing the location. The camera moves through open water before arriving at Bikini Bottom, and the tone of the narration is pleasant and calm, exactly the tone a documentary maker would use when introducing an interesting place. What the narration is actually introducing, in the light of Mr. Lawrence's confirmation, is the last surviving city on Earth, built in the crater of a civilization that destroyed itself with nuclear weapons. The Cousteau voice makes this sound like something worth watching, with a warm drink on a comfortable evening. Hillenburg designed it that way. The warmth of the framing and the darkness of what it frames are both completely intentional. The nuclear history of the real Bikini Atoll is the foundation this design sits on, and understanding it makes the show's visual choices feel less like whimsy and more like a specific record. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated 67 nuclear weapons across the Marshall Islands. 23 of those detonations happened at Bikini Atoll specifically. The tests began with Operation Crossroads in 1946, a series designed to study how naval vessels responded to nuclear blasts. The second test of that series, called Baker, was detonated 60 feet below the surface of the lagoon. The underwater detonation produced a column of water and displaced material that rose from the surface before collapsing outward, and the photographs of that moment became some of the most widely circulated images of the nuclear era. The Baker test was the first nuclear weapon ever detonated underwater. The shape of what it produced became a permanent part of the visual vocabulary of nuclear weapons documentation. That shape appears in every explosion in SpongeBob SquarePants. The column rises and the cloud spreads at the top, and it has been doing so in every episode since season 1. Kitchen accidents at the Krusty Krab, failed experiments in Plankton's laboratory, the various catastrophes that befall Bikini Bottom in the course of ordinary plots, they all resolve into the same shape, the shape of a nuclear detonation, the shape of the thing that ended the world the city is built from. The show repeats it so consistently, across so many episodes spanning so many years, that its presence cannot be explained as coincidence or as a generic cartoon convention. It is the specific shape of a specific class of event, and it appears specifically in a show whose creator was a marine biologist who knew exactly what that shape meant and why it was associated with the location he had named his city after. Sandy Cheeks introduces a complication that the post-nuclear framework handles in an interesting way. Sandy is a squirrel from Texas who lives in an air dome on the ocean floor, conducting scientific research in an environment that should be completely inhospitable to her. She breathes air. She requires a pressurized suit to move through Bikini Bottom. Her entire presence in the show depends on a reason for a land mammal to be living in a deep-sea city, and the show provides that reason through the premise that she is a scientist and an explorer who chose to come. Within the post-nuclear reading, Sandy represents the possibility that some surface life survived the catastrophe, not in organized civilization, but in isolated pockets. Individual survivors with enough resources and intelligence to adapt to the changed world. She came from above because there is still something above, but what is above is no longer the world that built the mufflers and the diving helmets. Sandy is a visitor from the ruins, visiting people who were already survivors. Rock Bottom, the deeper city that SpongeBob and Patrick discover by accident in a Season 2 episode, occupies its own position within the post-nuclear geography. The city exists further below Bikini Bottom, darker and colder and stranger, populated by creatures whose biology has been pushed further from any recognizable form. Their mouths produce sounds that SpongeBob cannot parse. Their bodies are shaped in ways that suggest mutation carried further than anything visible in Bikini Bottom proper. They are not dangerous, exactly, but they exist at a distance from the visitors from above that cannot be bridged in the course of a single episode. SpongeBob cannot find his way back. The escalators that connect Rock Bottom to the world above only move in one direction. The deeper the crater, the more complete the alteration, and the harder the return. The castle brought Bravo test of 1954 is the specific detonation that rock bottom most plausibly maps onto. Castle Bravo was the largest nuclear weapon the United States ever tested, a hydrogen bomb that yielded approximately 15 megatons and was significantly more powerful than the scientists who designed it had predicted. The explosion vaporized 3 reef islands entirely. The crater it left in the ocean floor near Bikini is still measurable today. The fallout from Castle Bravo traveled across thousands of square miles of ocean in the days following the detonation, reaching inhabited atolls and exposing people who had not been warned and had no way to protect themselves. The crater at the center of that event, the deepest point of impact from the most powerful weapon ever detonated at that location, is where rock bottom sits in the post-nuclear geography of the show's world. What the real Bikini Atoll looks like today is part of this story too. The lagoon is clear and the coral has recovered in many areas, and from the surface, the islands look quiet and green and almost inviting. The radiation in the soil is the part that does not show. Cesium-137 accumulates in the coconut crabs and in the fruit of the trees at levels that make them unsafe for regular consumption. Studies conducted in the years around the UNESCO World Heritage designation in 2010 found contamination levels in specific areas of the atoll comparable to readings taken around Chernobyl after 1986. The most contaminated nuclear accident site in European history has radiation measurements similar to those found in the soil of an island chain that looks, from above, like a vacation destination. The Bikinians have not gone home. The land that was taken from them in 1946, with a promise that it would be returned, remains too dangerous for them to live on more than 70 years later. Hillenburg chose this place with full knowledge of that history. He was a marine biologist who had spent years studying the ocean and teaching children about it, and the nuclear testing program in the Marshall Islands is not a detail that a working marine biologist would be unaware of. He picked Bikini Atoll specifically, named his city after it specifically, and then built a world whose every visual element reflects what the nuclear tests actually did to the physical environment of the region. The muffler houses and the salvaged anchors and the mutated biology and the mushroom cloud explosions are not random creative choices dressed up in cartoon logic. They are the considered decisions of a person who understood the history and wanted it present in the work without ever being announced. The show's cheerful surface and its dark foundation have been coexisting since the pilot episode. Children watching today see the pineapple and the Krusty Krab and SpongeBob's enormous rectangular face and laugh. The history underneath all of it, the displaced people, the contaminated land, the 67 weapons, the world that ended before any of the characters were born, stays exactly where Hillenburg put it, quiet, underneath everything, in plain sight for anyone who knows enough to look for the mushroom clouds, which appear in every episode, which have always been there, which the show has never once pointed at or named. Mr. Lawrence named it in December 2024, sitting in a room with his castmates, correcting a misconception that had been circulating for years. The world was dead. Bikini Bottom was what remained. The cartoon had been airing for 25 years. It kept airing the next day. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The post-apocalyptic foundation sat unconfirmed for 25 years, visible only in the shape of explosions and the origin of building materials, until a writer said plainly on camera what the show had been showing all along. But the darkness the show carries is not only in its hidden history, some of it is in specific episodes that aired, were seen by millions of children, and were then quietly changed or removed without announcement. The first of those changes involves a security system, a lit match, and a decision made in the weeks after September 2001. That is where the next section begins. Section 6. The gasoline that disappeared. Memory is a strange thing when it comes to television. A person can carry a scene in their head for 20 years, certain of exactly how it looked and how it made them feel, and then sit down to watch the same episode as an adult and find the scene simply gone. The episode plays on. The story continues. The moment they remember does not arrive. There is no gap, no visible cut, no indication that anything was removed. The version playing now moves smoothly past the place where the remembered scene used to be, and a person who does not already know what to look for would have no reason to suspect that anything had ever been different. This is what happened to a scene from the third season episode Just One Bite, which originally aired on October 5th, 2001, and which has been quietly missing a significant portion of its runtime in every version broadcast since early 2002. The people who saw the original airing remember it. The people who encountered the episode for the first time after the cut was made have no idea it ever existed. Both groups have been watching what they believe is the same episode, but they have not been watching the same episode at all. Just One Bite is built around a single comic premise. Squidward has spent years insisting, loudly and repeatedly, that he hates Krabby Patties. He finds them repulsive. He has no interest in them. The idea that he might want one one is, to him, offensive. SpongeBob, who cannot comprehend a universe in which someone does not love Krabby Patties, refuses to accept this and sets about trying to get Squidward to take a single bite. The episode tracks Squidward's resistance, his eventual secret capitulation, and the revelation that he is in fact deeply and helplessly addicted to the patties, to the point of breaking into the Krusty Krab in the middle of the night to eat from the patty vault discovered in that same episode. The break-in is where the deleted scene lived. In the original version of the episode, Mr. Krabs has installed a security system inside the Krusty Krab to keep out intruders, specifically plankton, though the system does not discriminate. The security system consists of a bucket of gasoline rigged above the door. When Squidward enters the building in the dark, the bucket tips, spilling gasoline across the floor. A mechanical arm drops a lit match onto it. The gasoline ignites. Squidward burns. He staggers into the kitchen, singed and blackened, and then a second bucket of gasoline falls from somewhere above him, for reasons the cartoon does not bother to explain, and the sequence repeats. Squidward burns again. He is thoroughly charred by the time he reaches the patty vault, at which point the episode continues, as it does in the edited version. The scene was broad cartoon violence in the tradition of decades of animated comedy. Squidward getting set on fire and burned is not, on its face, more extreme than the kind of physical punishment characters absorb in countless other cartoons. Tom and Jerry built an entire legacy on elaborately staged mutual destruction. Wile E. Coyote fell off cliffs and was flattened by boulders for decades without anyone demanding the footage be removed. By those standards, a brief scene of Squidward catching fire from a gasoline trap inside a restaurant should have been unremarkable. The episode aired on October 5th, 2001. That date matters. September 11th, 2001 was 24 days earlier, and the television industry in the United States was in the middle of a period of acute sensitivity about any content that could be connected, however loosely, to fire, destruction, or large-scale violence. Networks across the spectrum were pulling and editing and reconsidering content that had seemed entirely acceptable in August, and now seemed, in the specific emotional climate of October 2001, like something that needed to be handled more carefully. Nickelodeon was not immune to that reconsideration. The gasoline scene in Just One Bite aired on October 5th in the episode's debut broadcast, which means it made it through the initial airing before anyone decided it was a problem. The original version, complete with both gasoline explosions and the full sequence of Squidward burning twice, was broadcast and seen by everyone who watched that night. Then, beginning in January 2002, when the episode went into rerun rotation, the scene was gone. The two explosions had been cut entirely. The version that has aired in every rerun, on every home video release, on every streaming platform since then, moves directly from Squidward entering the Krusty Krab to Squidward in the kitchen, with no explanation for the transition and no burns on his body. For a long time, the reason for the cut was debated. The most commonly repeated explanation was September 11th, the timing being so close that the connection seemed obvious. The writer Jay Lender, one of the people who worked on the episode, addressed the question in a statement to a SpongeBob fan forum in January 2007, confirming that September 11th was a factor in the decision to remove the scene, but that there was also a standards and practices issue involved, separate from the timing. Then in June 2018, the current showrunner Vincent Waller addressed the question directly on Twitter, offering the clearest official explanation that has ever been given. Waller confirmed that the removal was due to a standards and practices issue, and that Nickelodeon had a policy against depicting a gag that involved a lit match and gasoline together. The implication of the gasoline scene, Waller explained, was that it showed something a child could conceivably imitate, and the network's standards did not allow for that regardless of the comedic framing. The September 11th connection, in Waller's account, was a contributing factor in the timing of the decision. The reason the scene was reviewed and flagged in the weeks after the episode first aired, rather than at some other point. But the standards and practices issue was the reason the scene stayed removed. The network's guidelines around imitable actions involving fire and flammable materials are not September 11th specific. They apply generally, and once the gasoline scene had been identified as a violation of those guidelines, it came out and stayed out. There is a small additional wrinkle to the story that is worth noting. In a much later season, season 13, an episode called SpongeBob on Parade features a gag in the climax involving a match and gasoline at parade float scale. When a fan noticed the apparent inconsistency and asked Waller about it on his Blue Sky account, Waller responded with a clarification that drew a distinction between the two scenes. The Just One Bite scene, he explained, showed a bucket of gasoline placed over a doorway, which is something a child could physically replicate with materials available in a typical home. The parade float scene involved a container of gas too large for any child to realistically reproduce. The imitable action test in the network's standards framework is not about whether something is violent or whether gasoline is involved. It is about whether the specific mechanics of the scene could be copied by a child in a real environment. The bucket over the door passed that test in the wrong direction. The parade float did not. What the deletion left behind is a version of the episode with a visible join. Viewers who know what to look for can see the moment where the cut happens. Squidward enters the Krusty Krab, and the next shot places him in the kitchen with no explanation of how he got there or why the environment looks the way it does. The episode does not try to paper over the gap. It simply continues, and the gap is only visible if a person already knows it is there. For most viewers, especially those who never saw the original, there is nothing unusual about the transition at all. The unedited version survives. It was recorded by viewers who taped the original broadcast. It aired for years on Canadian channels, including YTV and Nickelodeon Canada, which did not receive the edited version for an extended period. It was available on Video Now releases. It circulated on YouTube in various forms, where takedowns and re-uploads followed each other in cycles as the footage was removed and then found again. The SpongeBob preservation community documented the scene thoroughly, comparing the original and the edited versions, timing the gap, and preserving the original footage in the public archive. The scene is not lost. Anyone willing to spend 10 minutes searching can find it, but it is no longer part of the official version of the show, and it has not been part of the official version for over 20 years. The Just One Bite deletion is the first and in some ways the most instructive of the show's content removals, because the reasoning behind it was so specifically rooted in the mechanics of standards and practices rather than in any broader cultural or moral judgment. The scene was not removed because it was cruel, or because it targeted a vulnerable group, or because its content had become socially unacceptable in a way that had not been true when it was made. It was removed because a bucket of gasoline over a door and a lit match is something a child could try to do, and the network's job, as it understood its job, was to make sure that the show did not give children instructions for hurting themselves, even when those instructions were delivered in the context of a joke about an octopus trying to steal hamburgers in the dark. The show around the scene continued unchanged. Just One Bite remains one of the most beloved episodes of the third season. The Patty Vault, the revelation of Squidward's addiction, the image of Squidward stuffing himself in the dark surrounded by stacks of Krabby Patties. These moments are intact in every version of the episode that exists. The burning is gone, the rest is exactly as it was made. The episode works without the scene, which is partly why the removal was so clean. The plot does not require the security system gag. Squidward can get from the door to the kitchen without being burned twice, and the story loses nothing essential in the transition. What it loses is a detail about the world of the Krusty Krab, specifically that Mr. Krabs has installed a gasoline and match security system to protect the Patty Vault, which is both a piece of character information about Mr. Krabs' priorities and a signal about how seriously the show was, in its third season, taking the idea that the Patty Vault was worth protecting at extreme cost. A man who rigs his restaurant to burn intruders alive is a man with a particular relationship to his product. That detail did not survive into the version of the show that most people have seen, and Mr. Krabs is, as a result, slightly less extreme than Hillenburg and his team originally drew him. The cut to Just One Bite was made within months of the episode's first airing. The next major content removal in the show's history took considerably longer to arrive, and when it came not because of an imitable action concern, but because of a scene that the network decided, 4 years after the episode first aired, crossed a line it had not previously recognized. The episode was called Procrastination, and the scene involved a student, an open flame, and a choice the show's standards and practices team eventually decided they did not want children to see made so casually on screen. The procrastination cut is less famous than the gasoline scene, partly because it happened later, and partly because the removed content is less visually dramatic. But the fact that it happened at all, 4 years after the episode aired, is its own kind of story. The network reviewed something that had been sitting in its rotation for years, decided it no longer met the standard it wanted to hold, and removed it. The show moved forward. The missing piece stayed missing. The viewers who had seen the original 4 years earlier carried it in their memories, and the viewers who discovered the show after the cut had no idea there was anything to carry. This is the quiet pattern underneath the show's content history. The version that exists now is not the version that was made. It has been edited, reduced, reviewed, and adjusted across more than 2 decades, scene by scene, in response to events and standards and cultural moments that the people who made the original episodes could not have anticipated. The cheerful surface of SpongeBob SquarePants is, in part, the result of a long series of decisions made in offices by people whose job was to decide what children should and should not see. Most of what they removed was small, some of it was not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The gasoline scene was removed within months of airing, a standards and practices call made in the shadow of September 2001. But not every content decision the show has faced was made quickly or quietly. The most famous removal in the show's modern history took 15 years to arrive, was triggered by a cultural shift rather than a specific scene, and left behind an episode that millions of fans had grown up with and suddenly could not find anywhere. That episode is next. Section 7. The Panty Raid, the Standards Review, and the episode that vanished. There is a specific kind of confusion that comes from looking for something that used to be everywhere and finding it gone. A person who grew up watching SpongeBob SquarePants in the early 2000s, who remembers a particular episode clearly, who could describe the plot and quote lines from it, might one day open a streaming service and search for it and find nothing. Not hidden behind a content warning, not marked as unavailable in their region, simply absent, as if it had never been made. No explanation on the screen, no note, just the gap where the episode used to be, surrounded by episodes that are still there, the missing one invisible unless a person already knows to look for it. This is what happened to Midlife Crustacean, the second segment of the 15th episode of Season 3, which originally aired on January 24, 2003, in the United States. For 15 years, it sat in the show's regular rotation without serious incident. It was watched by millions of children, many of whom grew up and still carried memories of it. It was included on DVD box sets. It was streamed on the platforms that carried the show's back catalog. Then, in 2018, Nickelodeon quietly removed it from broadcast rotation. No announcement was made at the time. No explanation was offered. The episode simply stopped airing. And for several years, the only way most people learned it had been removed was by noticing it was not there. Midlife Crustacean is built around Mr. Krabs experiencing a midlife crisis. The episode opens with Mr. Krabs becoming aware, through a series of small indignities, that he has grown old. A customer at the Krusty Krab calls a dried-out Krabby Patty old, then looks at Mr. Krabs and says the same word in a different tone. Young fish at a bus stop do not recognize him as cool. His own body reminds him at every turn that the years have passed and accumulated into something he had not fully reckoned with. He becomes depressed in the specific way that the show handles Mr. Krabs' emotional states, loudly and with dramatic physical expression, his claws drooping, his voice dropping, his usual energy replaced by a kind of theatrical despair. SpongeBob and Patrick, genuinely trying to help, invite Mr. Krabs to join them on a night out. The premise of the first half of the episode is that Mr. Krabs expects the night to involve the kinds of activities he associates with being young and exciting, and what SpongeBob and Patrick actually do with their evenings is entirely mundane. They blow bubbles, they go to the laundromat, they look at rocks. Each activity that Mr. Krabs finds crushingly boring is presented by SpongeBob and Patrick with total sincerity and genuine enthusiasm, which is a joke about the gap between what adults think young people find exciting and what SpongeBob and Patrick, as characters who exist in a state of permanent, uncomplicated contentment, actually enjoy. Mr. Krabs' spirits lift considerably when Patrick announces that the final item on the evening's itinerary is a panty raid. The three of them break into a house in the middle of the night and rifle through a woman's underwear drawer. The raid is presented in the episode as a lark, a harmless expression of rebellious energy, the kind of youthful transgression that Mr. Krabs had been missing. The comedy of the scene depends on the audience reading it as the kind of mildly naughty behavior that makes an old man feel young again, rather than as anything more serious than that. The punchline is that the house belongs to Mr. Krabs' mother, who catches them in the act and sends Mr. Krabs to his room as punishment. His reaction, being sent to his childhood bedroom and lying there in the dark surrounded by his old belongings, is what finally makes him feel genuinely young again. The episode ends with him happy and the incident treated as a successful cure for his crisis. The episode aired without significant incident for 15 years. It was a well-regarded installment of the third season, which is broadly considered one of the show's strongest creative periods. The humor was consistent with the show's general tone of adult jokes delivered in children's animation, the kind of content that works on two levels depending on the age of the viewer. Children watching would have registered the panty raid as mildly transgressive without fully understanding why. Adults watching alongside them would have understood the reference and registered it as the show doing its usual thing of slipping something slightly edgy past the surface of the comedy. Then the cultural landscape shifted in a specific and significant way. The Me Too movement emerged publicly in late 2017 and accelerated through 2018, bringing with it a broad cultural re-examination of material that depicted the sexualization of women or the casual violation of their privacy and autonomy as acceptable or funny. The conversation was large and affected every area of media and entertainment. Films were reconsidered, television episodes were pulled, jokes that had seemed harmless or merely edgy in the early 2000s were being evaluated in a context that had fundamentally changed, and the evaluation was producing different results than the original airing had produced. Nickelodeon conducted conducted what it later described as a standards review of its programming catalog. The review examined episodes of the shows in its library for content that the network had concluded no longer met the standard it wanted to hold for children's programming. Midlife Crustacean was flagged. The episode was pulled from broadcast rotation in 2018. For 3 years, no official explanation was offered. The episode simply stopped appearing in the schedule, and when fans noticed its absence and asked about it, the network did not respond publicly. The explanation came in March 2021, when IGN contacted Nickelodeon for comment, and a spokesperson confirmed what had happened. The representative told IGN that Midlife Crustacean had been out of rotation since 2018, following a standards review in which the network had determined that some story elements were not appropriate for young children. The representative did not elaborate further. No specific scene was named. No mention was made of the panty raid. The language was careful and general, but the implication was clear enough that almost no one who read the statement needed it spelled out. The 2021 confirmation generated significant public discussion, partly because the removal had already been happening for 3 years without acknowledgement, and partly because the episode was a genuinely well-liked installment from a beloved season. Fans who had grown up watching it had strong feelings about it. Some of those feelings were supportive of the removal, acknowledging that a scene depicting 3 characters breaking into a woman's home to go through her underwear drawer sent a message, however lightly packaged, that the show probably should not be sending to children. Others pushed back, arguing that the comedic framing and the specific punchline, the reveal that the underwear belonged to Mr. Krabs' mother, drained the scene of any genuine menace, and that pulling the episode overstated the harm it could do. What neither side of the debate fully addressed was the specific context of the scene within the episode's emotional arc. The panty raid works as a joke in Midlife Crustacean, not despite the fact that it involves breaking into a woman's home, but because the episode frames it as something exciting, something rebellious, something that makes a man feel young and alive in a way that ordinary activities cannot. The framing is the problem, more than the specific content. The scene does not depict a crime and then show consequences. It depicts a crime and then shows reward. Mr. Krabs feels better after the panty raid. He feels young. The punchline involving his mother is a humiliation, but it is a humiliation of a different kind than one that would follow logically from what the 3 characters actually did. The show punishes him for raiding his mother's underwear, not for raiding a woman's underwear in general. The specific act, the breaking and entering, the violation of someone's private belongings, receives no consequence. In 2021, Paramount Plus removed the episode from its streaming catalog as well. It remained available on DVD box sets and could be purchased on some digital platforms as part of bundled season collections, but it was no longer accessible on the primary streaming service that carried the show's back catalog, and it was not available for individual digital purchase on most platforms. The companion episode in the same time slot, The Great Snail Race, remained fully available. Then, in July 2023, something unexpected happened. A technical glitch on the Paramount Plus channel, running through Amazon Prime Video, accidentally restored Midlife Crustacean to the service for a brief window. Subscribers who had a specific Paramount Plus bundle linked to their Prime Video account discovered, suddenly, that they could watch the episode for the first time in years. The discovery spread quickly through SpongeBob fan communities online. People who had been waiting since 2018 to see the episode again rushed to watch it before the window closed. A Nickelodeon spokesperson confirmed to IGN that the restoration had been an accident, describing it as an episode that had been inadvertently made available for a brief period due to a technical error, and confirming that it had been promptly removed again once the error was identified. The accidental restoration lasted long enough for a significant number of people to watch or rewatch the episode, and the conversation it generated was interesting precisely because the episode itself, watched in 2023 rather than 2003, read differently to many of the people who encountered it again. The panty raid scene, which had registered for most viewers in the early 2000s as a slightly edgy joke, read in the context of 20 years of changed cultural conversation as something more uncomfortable. The framing that had seemed light and comic in 2003 had not changed. The frame around the frame had changed, and that was enough. The episode remains available on physical home media. The DVD box sets that include it have not been recalled. Anyone who owns the right disc can watch it without any difficulty. The removal is from the official broadcast and streaming record, not from every copy that was ever made. This is consistent with how most content removals of this kind work. The goal is not to eliminate the episode from existence, but to remove it from the platform where it reaches its primary audience, which is children watching the show on television or through the family streaming subscription. The DVD is a different kind of access, voluntary and deliberate rather than ambient and scheduled. Midlife Crustacean is the clearest example in the show's history of a content decision driven not by a specific network standard about imitable actions, fans, the way the Just One Bite cut was, but by a broader cultural reassessment of what kinds of jokes a children's show should be making. The gasoline scene was removed because a child could replicate it. The panty raid episode was removed because a culture had decided that framing the violation of a woman's privacy as a fun adventure was not a message worth continuing to send. The two decisions came from different places, were made in different ways, and removed very different kinds of content, but they are part of the same long story of a show being quietly edited by the world it was made in, one cut at a time. The episode that millions of people remember watching as children is not available to the children watching the show now. The memories and the current catalog have quietly diverged, and the gap between them is one of the places where the show's real history lives. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Midlife Crustacean was pulled because a cultural conversation caught up with a joke the show had been making since 2003. But there are two episodes in the show's history that contain content significantly darker than a panty raid, content that deals directly with suicide, and neither of them has ever been pulled. Both still air. Both are still on streaming. The next section walks through exactly what is in them and why the network has never removed them. Section 8. One Course Meal. Are You Happy Now? And the suicide episodes that got through 2 episodes of SpongeBob SquarePants are routinely described in fan discussions and critical writing and comment sections across the internet as the darkest the show has ever produced. Neither of them was ever pulled from the broadcast schedule. Neither of them has been removed from streaming. Both are still available on Paramount Plus today, and both still appear occasionally in the show's regular rotation. By the standards the network used to remove Midlife Crustacean and to edit Just One Bite, both of these episodes are arguably more disturbing than anything that was ever taken off the air. They were not taken off the air. They are still there. The reasons they survived, and the conversation around them, say something important about how the show's content gatekeepers have understood their own job across the years. The first of the two is One Course Meal, which aired on March 25, 2010, as part of Season 7. The episode was written by Aaron Springer, Chris Mitchell, and Mr. Lawrence, the longtime writer who also voices Plankton. The plot begins simply enough. Plankton makes another attempt to steal the Krabby Patty secret formula. The attempt fails, as it always does, but this time the failure happens when Pearl, Mr. Krabs' teenage whale daughter, enters the restaurant and sends Plankton running in absolute terror. Plankton, it emerges, has a profound and debilitating phobia of whales. This is presented as a biological fact rather than an absurdity. Plankton is a microscopic organism. Whales consume microscopic organisms. The fear, in the logic of the show's world, is not irrational at all. Mr. Krabs discovers the phobia and immediately begins exploiting it. He starts dressing up as Pearl and appearing outside the chum bucket at night to terrify Plankton. He recruits the actual Pearl to make surprise appearances. He shows up in the dark in a dress that belongs to his daughter and screams at his business rival through the windows of the restaurant where Plankton lives. He does this not once but repeatedly over the course of 16 days with no sign of stopping and no apparent concern for what the sustained psychological campaign is doing to the person on the receiving end of it. What it is doing is visible on screen. Plankton begins having nightmares. The episode shows him waking in terror, the nightmares involving Pearl eating him and his cousins alive. His cognitive functioning deteriorates. He becomes unable to distinguish between real threats and the phantom Pearl that Mr. Krabs has been manufacturing. He stops functioning at the basic level of operating his restaurant and living his life. The show depicts this deterioration with more visual specificity than it typically brings to Plankton's suffering, tracking the progression from fear to paranoia to something that reads, with no ambiguity, as a complete psychological breakdown. The breakdown leads to the scene that the episode is remembered for. Plankton walks out of the chum bucket and lies down on the road in the middle of Bikini Bottom. He is waiting for the 4 o'clock bus. He tells SpongeBob, who has followed him outside out of concern, that he intends to be run over. The show does not obscure what Plankton is describing. He is lying in the road because he wants the bus to kill him. SpongeBob's response is to try to talk him out of it, which he eventually manages by revealing that Pearl was Mr. Krabs in disguise the entire time. An anger-inducing revelation that pulls Plankton back into his combative default state and away from the passive despair of the road. What the episode does not do, and what distinguishes it from Midlife Crustacean in terms of its survival in the rotation, is treat Plankton's moment on the road as funny. The show does not play it for laughs. SpongeBob is genuinely distressed. The scene is quiet and still, in a way that the show's comedy sequences are not. The intent, as far as the episode's tone communicates intent, seems to be that the audience should recognize this as a serious consequence of what Mr. Krabs has been doing and feel the weight of it. The problem, which critics and fans have been pointing out since the episode first aired, is that the ending does not follow from that recognition. Mr. Krabs learns what happened, laughs, laughs, and the episode ends with the status quo restored and the man who engineered 16 days of psychological torture facing no meaningful consequence for having done so. The moral architecture of the ending is what the episode's detractors find most troubling. One Course Meal does not argue that what Mr. Krabs did was acceptable, but it also does not argue the opposite with any force. It shows a character being driven to the road by sustained psychological torture, and then it shows the person responsible laughing, and then it ends. The laugh is the last significant beat. The show does not counterweigh it. In a different kind of episode, the laugh might be ironic, a signal that the audience should feel the discomfort of watching someone find amusement in another person's suffering. In One Course Meal, the comedy framing makes the irony difficult to sustain. The laugh lands as a laugh. The episode moves on. The second of the two dark episodes is Are You Happy Now?, which aired on March 31st, 2012, as part of Season 8. The episode was written by Luke Brookshire, Mark Sechelari, and Danny McKaylee, and directed by Vincent Waller. Its premise is gentler than One Course Meal on the surface. SpongeBob learns that Squidward has no happiest memory. He cannot think of a single moment in his life that he would describe as his happiest. This discovery genuinely upsets SpongeBob, and he embarks on a sustained effort to create a happiest memory for Squidward, taking him to a concert, a museum, and a hot air balloon ride, each attempt ending in a different form of misery. The first half of the episode is consistent with the show's general approach to Squidward as a character whose dignity is perpetually being assaulted by circumstances beyond his control. The concert results in a violin bow lodged in his eye. The museum results in his artwork being burned by a famous critic who considers destruction to be his artistic medium. The balloon ride results in a crash landing on a mountain. Each disaster is presented with the visual language of slapstick, broad and quick, and designed to generate laughter rather than distress. Then the episode turns. 2 weeks pass. Squidward has withdrawn entirely. He has not left his house. He has not answered the door. The curtains are drawn. SpongeBob, watching through the window, sees his neighbor sitting in a darkened room, wearing the beginnings of a beard, staring at nothing. SpongeBob says, with audible worry in his voice, that at least they know Squidward is still alive. The line is not a throwaway. It is the show acknowledging, in plain language, that SpongeBob was afraid Squidward might not be. Inside the house, Squidward is shown in 2 scenes that have become the most discussed and debated moments in the episode's history. In the first, he picks up a rope, holds it for a moment, and says he cannot seem to get happy, wondering aloud if this will help. He throws the rope over a beam. The shot holds. Then the rope pulls taut to reveal a birdcage being hoisted toward the ceiling, with a small scallop inside it. In the second scene, Squidward opens an oven, leans toward it, and the next shot reveals him pulling out a tray of brownies. Both scenes are constructed as bait-and-switch gags, designed to lead the audience toward one reading and then pull away at the last moment. The rope is a noose until it is not. The oven is a method until it is not. The gags work as gags. The timing is precise. The reveals land as comic beats. What makes them unusual, and what has kept them in discussion since the episode first aired, is that in order for the bait portion of the bait-and-switch to function, the audience has to read the setup correctly. A viewer who does not understand what the rope and the oven are implying does not experience the relief of the reveal. The joke only works if the viewer recognizes what Squidward appears to be doing. For an adult viewer, or for a teenager who has any exposure to the way depression is discussed, the recognition is immediate. For a younger child, the setups may simply be confusing. The episode is, in a precise and uncomfortable sense, asking its audience to complete the joke by supplying an understanding that children's television generally does not assume its audience has. The scenes pass through standards and practices. The episode aired without edit. It has continued to air and stream without edit in the years since. The fact that it survived the content review process that removed midlife crustacean raises a genuine question about the consistency of the standard being applied. The Panty Raid episode was removed because it depicted behavior that violated a woman's privacy and framed it as a fun adventure. The Birdcage episode, which twice uses the visual language of suicide as the setup for a comedy reveal, has never been touched. One possible explanation is the distinction between imitable action and tonal framing. The gasoline scene in Just One Bite was removed because a child could physically replicate the specific mechanics of the scene. The Panty Raid was removed because the framing endorsed behavior the network had decided to distance itself from. The birdcage and oven scenes in Are You Happy Now? Do not endorse anything. They do not frame suicide as a solution or as something that ends well. The bait portion of the bait and switch is dark precisely because the show does not follow through on it. The joke relies on the audience's relief that Squidward is not actually doing what he appeared to be doing. Whether that framing is sufficient justification for the scenes existing in a children's cartoon is a question the fan community has been arguing for over a decade without resolving. What both episodes share, underneath their different approaches, establishes is a willingness to go somewhere that the show's creators and the network had previously treated as off-limits. The show had always been willing to be dark in a visual sense, gross-out humor, physical destruction, the grotesque body horror of certain season 6 and 7 episodes. What One Course Meal and Are You Happy Now represent is a different kind of darkness, one that is psychological rather than physical, one that deals with despair and the desire to stop existing rather than with pain and humiliation. The show moved into that territory in these 2 episodes, and the network, for reasons it has never fully explained, decided both times to let the territory stand. The fan response to both episodes has been sharp and sustained. One Course Meal regularly appears on lists of the worst episodes of the series, not because it is technically incompetent, but because the moral framework of its ending strikes many viewers as genuinely wrong. Are You Happy Now draws a more divided response, with some viewers finding the birdcage and oven jokes clever, and some finding them deeply uncomfortable, and neither group fully able to explain why the other's response is unreasonable. The discomfort is real on both sides. Both episodes did something the show had not done before, and the record of what they did is still there, still available, still airing, unlike the Panty Raid episode that was removed for considerably less. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 2 episodes containing content darker than anything the network has ever removed are still in rotation, still on streaming, still being watched. But the darkest version of SpongeBob SquarePants has never been on Nickelodeon at all. It exists in a corner of the internet built by fans, beginning with a single forum post in April 2010, and the show itself has since reached back and acknowledged it. The next section walks through the Squidward's suicide creepypasta, the Red Mist tape, and the shadow culture the fanbase has been constructing underneath the official show for 15 years. Section 9, the Red Mist tape, the whale carcass theory, and the shadows the fanbase built. On April 6, 2010, an anonymous user posted a piece of writing to a forum called 7chan in a subforum dedicated to paranormal stories and strange experiences. The post was long and written in a calm, methodical tone, the kind of voice that witness accounts often take when the person writing them wants to be believed. The anonymous user claimed to have been, in 2005, an intern at Nickelodeon Studios, working with the editors and animators on the SpongeBob SquarePants production team as part of completing a degree in animation. He claimed that one afternoon, he and 2 other interns and several lead animators and sound editors had gathered in an editing room to watch what was supposed to be the rough cut of the season 4 premiere episode, an episode called Fear of a Krabby Patty. He claimed that when the cassette tape was loaded and the footage began to play, the title that appeared on screen was not Fear of a Krabby Patty. The title that appeared on a black title card was Squidward's Suicide. The post went on to describe what the assembled group supposedly watched. The episode began normally enough. Squidward was preparing for a clarinet concert, practicing in his home, while SpongeBob and Patrick played outside and interrupted him repeatedly. The concert took place and went badly. The audience booed. Squidward returned home humiliated. Up to this point, the alleged episode was simply a sad version of a familiar SpongeBob premise. The octopus whose artistic ambitions are perpetually crushed by the indifference of the world around him. Then, according to the post, the footage began to change. The character's eyes became wrong, hyper-realistic in a way that animated eyes are not, pupils replaced by something that looked more like a real eye than a drawn one. Sounds that did not belong in the episode appeared on the audio track, crying that did not sound like a voice actor performing crying, but like something recorded from a real person in real distress. And then, the post claimed, brief images began to appear in the footage, flashing on screen for single frames, images of children who had been harmed. The post described the assembled team watching in growing horror as the footage continued, Squidward's condition worsening on screen, the imagery becoming more disturbing, until the episode ended with Squidward in his room holding a shotgun, and then a single shot, and then black. The post then described the aftermath, the reactions of the people in the room, the investigation that supposedly followed, the conclusion that the tape had been tampered with by someone outside the studio, though the identity of that person was never established. The post ended without resolution, the way the best creepypasta stories end, leaving the reader in the same unresolved state as the writer. The story was fictional. This is not a matter of debate or interpretation. The person who wrote it, who later identified themselves on Reddit in February 2013 under the username Suicide Squidward, confirmed that they had written it as a piece of horror fiction, a genre that had been developing online under the name creepypasta for several years by that point. The writer said they had not expected the story to travel far beyond the 7chan board where they posted it, and were surprised by how widely it spread. The story is not a true account. There was no intern, there was no tape, there was no Squidward suicide episode. The production team at Nickelodeon has never produced anything resembling what the post describes. None of that stopped it from spreading. The story story moved from 7chan to other forums, then to early social media platforms, then to YouTube, where multiple narrated readings accumulated millions of views in the years following the original post. A video described as a recreation of the footage appeared, built from spliced clips of existing SpongeBob episodes with audio manipulations and edited imagery. The video circulated widely and was taken down and re-uploaded in cycles as platforms applied their content policies to it. The story introduced phrases and conventions that became standard in the creepypasta genre that followed it, the hyper-realistic eyes in particular becoming so associated with horror fiction about cartoons that it became a cliché, repeated in hundreds of imitations until the phrase lost its power entirely. The companion story called Red Mist appeared shortly after, written by a different anonymous author and expanding on the Squidward's suicide framework with additional invented details. Red Mist is the name most people associate with the visual image of Squidward that emerged from the legend, a close-up of Squidward's face from the third season episode Just One Bite that had been altered to give him bloodshot red eyes and a blank, haunted expression. The image circulated separately from the story, becoming a meme in its own right, associated first with the creepypasta and then, years later, with internet humor that had drifted far from the original horror context. The Squidward suicide story is, in retrospect, an early and clear example of how internet fan communities interact with beloved childhood properties. The show was cheerful, the show had dark moments, as this video has been documenting across 9 sections, but the show was not, by any honest measure, a horror text. The creepypasta transformed it into one by inverting its most recognizable elements: the familiar character, the familiar setting, the familiar premise of Squidward's humiliation and despair. All of these were taken and pushed into territory the actual show never approached. The result was something that felt, to people who encountered it in the right frame of mind and at the right age, genuinely disturbing in a way that was inseparable from how much they had loved the source material. The show's own response to the legend was interesting and took 2 forms. The first was the direct denial from the production team, which emerged whenever the story gained enough traction that someone directly asked a person connected to the show whether it was real. The answers were always no. The story is not real. No such episode was ever made. The tape does not exist. These denials were necessary and accurate, and they had essentially no effect on the story's spread, because denial is a weak force against a well-told piece of horror fiction that has already embedded itself in a generation's collective imagination. The second response was stranger and more revealing. The show eventually winked at the legend directly. In season 12, an episode called SpongeBob in Randomland aired, in which SpongeBob and Squidward travel to a place called Randomland and find a wall of doors, each opening onto a different strange version of their world. Squidward opens one of the doors and finds, staring back at him, a version of himself with the bloodshot red eyes from the famous altered image associated with the creepypasta. The character design for the moment, called Red Mist Squidward in the show's production materials, was drawn by storyboard artist Adam Paloian. A composer who had joined the crew named Ego Plum wrote an original piece of music for the moment specifically titled Red Mist Q, referencing the story directly. Vincent Waller confirmed that the intent was to make a reference to the fan fiction, describing it as a nod to what he called silly trying to be dark fan fiction. The scene aired, then it was edited out of subsequent broadcasts. The Red Mist Squidward character was replaced in later versions of the episode with a different Squidward variant, Baby Squidward in a diaper. The replacement happened without announcement, and the reason for it has never been officially explained, though the most commonly offered explanation is that the reference was considered too obscure or too unsettling for younger viewers who would have no context for what they were seeing. The show reached out to acknowledge the legend and then, almost immediately, pulled the acknowledgement back and covered it over. The Red Mist Squidward reference is now itself a piece of the show's altered content history, seen in the original broadcast and then removed, documented by the preservation community, unavailable in the current official version. The whale carcass theory, which developed separately from the creepypasta tradition and occupies a different register entirely, is the darkest fan theory about the show's established canon. The theory begins with a genuine mystery in the show, the identity of Pearl's mother. Pearl is Mr. Krabs' teenage daughter, a full-size sperm whale who towers over the other characters and whose relationship to her father is one of the show's recurring sources of comedy. Mr. Krabs is a crab, Pearl is a whale. The show has never explained how they are related, and the creative decision not to explain it was made explicitly to honor Steven Hillenburg's wish that Pearl's backstory not be explored in the cartoon. The whale carcass theory proposes a specific and disturbing explanation. In the real ocean, when a whale dies and sinks to the ocean floor, the carcass creates an entire ecosystem. Organisms colonize it. It sustains life for decades. The theory proposes that Mr. Krabs discovered such a whale fall on the ocean floor, recognized its potential as a food food source and built the Krusty Krab on top of or around it. The whale whose carcass he found was Pearl's mother. The secret ingredient in the Krabby Patty formula is derived from that carcass. Mr. Krabs adopted the orphaned Pearl out of guilt, or practicality, or some combination of the two, and has been raising the daughter of the creature whose remains he has been selling as food ever since. Pearl, in this reading, has been living with the man who profits from her mother's body without ever knowing it. The theory is, by the show's own canon, incorrect. Vincent Waller has directly stated that the Krabby Patty contains no animal product, which rules out the carcass ingredient. The show's rules about the formula, confirmed by multiple members of the production team across multiple years, do not allow for any animal-derived ingredient. The whale carcass theory is fan fiction, not canon, and it has been addressed as such by the people best positioned to address it. What makes it interesting as a piece of fan creativity is that it uses the show's genuine, unexplained gaps, Pearl's mysterious parentage, the unknown formula, Mr. Krabs' unusual family structure, as the raw material for a story that the show itself would never tell, but that fits the available evidence in a way that is unsettling, precisely because it almost makes sense. The broader fan culture that produced both the creepypasta tradition and the darker theories has been building a parallel version of Bikini Bottom since the early years of the show. The official version is bright, comic, and deliberately unconcerned with continuity or consequence. The fan version is darker, more internally consistent, and treats the show's genuine dark moments, one course meal, Are You Happy Now?, the post-nuclear foundation, the broken friendship between Mr. Krabs and Plankton, as evidence for a reading of the show that the network would never sanction. In the fan version, Mr. Krabs is a genuinely dangerous figure who has driven at least one character to the road and attempted to kill another with a mallet in the episode Out of the Picture. Plankton is a tragic figure whose villainy is inseparable from a real grievance. Patrick is not lovably dim, but something more unsettling, a character whose casual cruelty to those around him is enabled by his complete disconnection from consequence. Mrs. Puff is a person with genuine trauma sustained across years of crashes that the show plays as comedy. Each of these darker readings starts from something that actually happens in the show and extends it in a direction the show itself does not go. The evidence is real. The extension is the fans' work. The result is a version of SpongeBob SquarePants that has been living next to the official version for over 20 years, visible only to people who choose to look at the source material through that particular lens. Steven Hillenburg built a world strange and specific enough to sustain both versions simultaneously. The pineapple is a home, and it is also the residence of a survivor of a nuclear catastrophe. The Krusty Krab is a restaurant, and it is also a former retirement home owned by a depressed war veteran. The Krabby Patty is a burger, and it is also an addiction and a mystery, and the source of a broken friendship. The show contains all of these things at once, the cheerful surface and the dark interior, and the fan community has been mapping the interior for as long as the show has been airing, producing a document of the show's hidden life that is, in its own way, as complete and as carefully assembled as anything the preservation community has ever recovered from an old tape or a deleted storyboard. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The fan community built a darker Bikini Bottom from the show's own evidence, and the creepypasta legend grew large enough that the show reached back to acknowledge it before quietly removing the acknowledgement. But the strangest legacy of SpongeBob SquarePants belongs to the man who started it all, a marine biology teacher who designed a post-apocalyptic city, hid its history in plain sight, and watched it become something far larger than he ever wanted. The final section brings everything together. Section 10, the legacy, the legend, and the sponge that outlasted its creator. There is a specific kind of strangeness that comes from a thing outgrowing the person who made it. It happens with books and films and songs, the moment when the created thing becomes so large that the creator's original intentions become just one reading among many, no longer authoritative, no longer the frame through which most people encounter the work. Steven Hillenburg experienced this while he was still alive, and he experienced it in a form more complete and more commercially overwhelming than most creators ever have to face. The show he built from a Tide Pool comic became a $15 billion franchise while he was still working on it, and the distance between what he had wanted it to be and what it became was something he never fully made peace with. He had wanted children to look at tide pools. He had wanted them to notice the plankton and the crabs and the starfish and feel some connection to the ocean and its creatures. He had built a world with extraordinary care, grounding it in real marine biology, real geography, real history, giving it internal rules that held across seasons, and a visual logic that rewarded attention. He had designed it with the soul of a scientist and the eye of a painter, and the storytelling instincts of someone who had spent years watching what happened when children were shown something true and strange and alive. What he got back from from the world was a franchise. Plush toys and fast food promotions and theme park rides and spin-off series that expanded the world in directions he had specifically and repeatedly said he did not want it to go. He stepped down as showrunner in 2004 rather than continue producing a show he had designed to end with the first film. He came back years later, drawn back partly by loyalty to the world he had built and partly by something that is harder to name, the pull of a creation that had become the defining fact of his professional life, whether he was working on it or not. He kept working after his ALS diagnosis in 2017, contributing to the show in whatever way his condition allowed, because the show was still the most direct line between his imagination and the world. He died in November 2018, with episodes he had worked on still in production, episodes that aired after his death with his contribution embedded in them in ways the audience had no way of knowing about. The show did not pause. It could not pause. SpongeBob SquarePants is a production infrastructure as much as a creative work, a system of writers and animators and voice actors and network relationships and merchandise agreements that does not have a natural stopping point. The 16th season has been produced. New spin-offs have been commissioned. Camp Coral, the prequel series showing SpongeBob and his friends as children, exists despite Hillenburg having spent years making clear he did not want the characters' childhoods depicted. The Patrick Star Show exists. New theatrical films are in development. The world Hillenburg built from a small comic about tide pools now contains content pipelines that extend in every direction and that he was not alive to approve or resist. The plush toys have washed up on beaches. He once told a colleague that finding a SpongeBob plush doll washed up on a beach like garbage was his worst nightmare as a creator. The ocean he spent his career wanting children to care about now carries his creation's image on merchandise that ends up in landfills and waterways, and exactly the kind of places he had hoped the show would teach people to protect. The irony is not subtle. It is simply the way things went, the way things tend to go when a commercial enterprise is large enough and old enough and profitable enough that the original intentions of the person who started it become one small voice in a room full of much louder ones. What he left behind, beyond the franchise and beyond the merchandise, is a body of work that contains more than most people ever realized was there. The sections of this video have traced that hidden content carefully. The Post-Apocalyptic Foundation, confirmed by Mr. Lawrence on camera in December 2024, the broken friendship between Mr. Krabs and Plankton that gives the show's central comedy its genuine tragic spine, the 7 deadly sins baked into the character designs, the Krusty Krab built from a failed retirement home by a veteran in a deep depression, the secret formula sealed in a bottle that only SpongeBob's emotional memory can open. None of this required excavation in the sense of finding lost or hidden documents. It was all in the show, visible in episodes that aired on Nickelodeon for children on Saturday mornings, sitting underneath the comedy and the bright colors and the theme song, waiting for someone to look at it from a slightly different angle for slightly longer than the joke required. The alterations and removals documented in the second half of this video represent a different kind of hidden content, the show that was made versus the show that survives in the official record. The gasoline scene in Just One Bite, broadcast once in October 2001 and gone from every version of the episode since early 2002. The scenes removed from procrastination, taken out years after the episode first aired. Midlife Crustacean, pulled from broadcast in 2018 without announcement, restored accidentally by a technical glitch in 2023, and removed again within days of anyone noticing it was back. Red Mist Squidward, drawn into a storyboard with an original music cue composed specifically for the moment, broadcast once, and then replaced in subsequent versions of the episode with a different image entirely. The version of SpongeBob SquarePants that exists today is assembled from what remained after each of these decisions, a version of the show that is more carefully managed than what was originally produced, and that is missing specific moments that the people who were watching on the right nights still carry in their memories 20 years later. The suicide episodes complicate this picture in a way that has never been resolved. One Course Meal and Are You Happy Now both contain content that is, by any neutral comparison, darker in its subject matter than the panty raid scene that got Midlife Crustacean pulled from streaming. The panty raid was removed because a cultural conversation had changed around the specific behavior it depicted, breaking into a woman's home and treating her private belongings as the material for a fun adventure. The suicide content in the other 2 episodes survived because the specific framing, bait-and-switch comedy in Are You Happy Now and unresolved moral consequence in One Course Meal fell into a gap in the standards the network was applying. The gap is not an accident. It reflects a real difference in what standards and practices is designed to catch and what it is not designed to catch. But it also means that the show's official record contains episodes dealing with characters lying down in traffic and appearing to prepare a noose, while the show's streaming catalog does not contain an episode where 3 cartoon characters sneak into a house to steal underwear. The 2 decisions are consistent with the specific rules that produce them. They are not consistent with each other in any broader moral sense. The creepypasta tradition and the fan theory culture represent a third layer of the show's hidden life, one built entirely outside the official production and reaching, in some cases, further into the public imagination than the genuine dark content ever did. The Squidward suicide story, confirmed as fiction by its own author in 2013, has been encountered by more people than have ever seen the original unedited Just One Bite. The vague sense that there is somewhere a disturbing secret episode of SpongeBob, a feeling that settled into an entire generation's relationship with the show through the spread of the creepypasta and its many imitations, is more widespread than any accurate knowledge of the Bikini Atoll confirmation or the friend or foe backstory. The legend outran the truth. Legends almost always do. And the truth is now permanently tangled with the legend in ways that cannot be separated without explaining both, which is why this video has spent as much time on the creepypasta as on the confirmed canon. The show's own wink at the Red Mist legend, the storyboarded appearance of the altered Squidward image, the original music titled Red Mist Q, written specifically for that 4-second moment, is the most revealing thing the production team ever did in relation to the fan culture surrounding the show. They were aware of the legend. They had been aware of it for years. They chose to acknowledge it, framing the acknowledgement as affectionate mockery, the show looking back at the story that had been told about it and smiling at how seriously people had taken a piece of fiction. Then they removed the acknowledgement from subsequent broadcasts, so the wink exists now only in the memory of people who saw the original airing and in the documentation of the preservation community that recorded it before it was gone. The show reached out to the legend with one hand and erased the gesture with the other. The moment is now part of the altered content history it was gently mocking. The whale carcass theory sits in its own category, darker in implication than the creepypasta tradition because it builds from the show's genuine, unexplained mysteries rather than from invented horror. Pearl's mother is a gap the show chose deliberately to leave open. The formula's ingredients are a secret the writers have maintained for over 25 years. The biological relationship between a crab and a whale is an absurdity the show planted and never resolved. The whale carcass theory fills all 3 gaps with a single explanation that the show's own canon has ruled out, but that the available evidence, taken in isolation, fits with uncomfortable precision. Vincent Waller's confirmation that the formula contains no animal product closes the theory as canon. It does not close the question of why someone thought to ask it, or why the answer, once heard, is not easily unheard. The broader fan culture that produced the creepypasta and the darker theories has been building a parallel version of Bikini Bottom since the early years of the show. In the official version, Mr. Krabs is a greedy comic villain who loves money and occasionally goes too far. In the fan version, he is a man who psychologically tortured a business rival for 16 days until that rival lay down on a road, and who laughed when he was told about it, and who in a later episode attempted to beat an employee to death with a mallet to inflate the resale value of that employee's artwork. In the official version, Plankton is a hapless antagonist whose schemes always fail and who is fundamentally comic in his persistence. In the fan version, he is a man with a legitimate grievance whose obsession is inseparable from something that was genuinely taken from him, and whose life, including his marriage to a computer he built himself because no one else would stay, is a portrait of isolation that the show plays for laughs, while the evidence for reading it otherwise is sitting right there in the same frames. Squidward has attracted the most sustained fan attention of any character in the show's history, which makes sense because Squidward is the character whose situation most directly maps onto adult experience. Children love SpongeBob. Teenagers find Patrick funny. Adults, by the time they are old enough to have jobs they did not choose, neighbors who exhaust them, and ambitions that have not been met, tend to look at Squidward and recognize something: his failed artistic career, his inability to be liked despite desperately wanting to be, his daily endurance of an environment that offers him nothing he actually wants. The show has, across its run, turned Squidward's misery into comedy, with varying degrees of awareness about what it is actually depicting. Are You Happy Now is the episode where that awareness was highest and the comedy was thinnest, the episode where the show looked directly at Squidward's depression and held the gaze long enough that the joke became difficult to find. The SpongeBob SquarePants fan theory ecosystem is, in the end, the natural consequence of Hillenburg building a world specific enough to sustain scrutiny. A world with invented geography and no internal consistency cannot generate serious fan theories because there is no stable ground to build from. A world where the buildings are made from specific salvaged materials, where the characters have detailed backstories that appear in single episodes and are never referenced again, where the formula exists in a specific bottle stored in a specific safe that requires a combination tied tied to a specific emotional memory, that world can support the weight of sustained attention. The fans applied that attention and found what Hillenburg had put there, and then kept going past what he had put there into the spaces he had left deliberately empty. Steven Hillenburg built those empty spaces on purpose. The formula is never fully revealed because the mystery is more useful than the answer. Pearl's backstory is never told because Hillenburg decided it should not be told, and the production has honored that decision since his death. The relationship between Mr. Krabs and Plankton is given its full tragic backstory once, and then mostly set aside because the show works better as a comedy than as a drama about two old friends who destroyed each other over a piece of paper. The empty spaces are design choices, as deliberate as the lobster trap shape of the Krusty Krab and the mushroom cloud shape of every explosion. Hillenburg left room for the audience to exist inside the world, and the audience has been filling that room ever since. The show he left behind is stranger and richer than its reputation suggests, and its reputation is already very good. A children's cartoon that has run for over 25 years, produced 4 films, a Broadway musical, and a franchise worth $15 billion, while also containing a confirmed post-apocalyptic origin, 2 episodes with suicide content that have never been pulled, a central character designed around greed, so total it functions as a clinical condition, a creepypasta legend the show itself winked at before erasing the wink, and a world built on top of one of the darkest real locations in the modern Pacific. All of it coexisting, all of it still airing, all of it still reaching children who will grow up and eventually find the layers underneath the pineapple. A quiet marine biology teacher from Anaheim drew a comic about tide pools to teach children about the ocean. The comic became a pitch. The pitch became a show. The show became a phenomenon that outlasted him and is still expanding 8 years after his death. The original concept of the world was post-apocalyptic, set on top of a nuclear graveyard, populated by mutated survivors of a war that ended before the first episode aired. The show walked away from that concept openly and carried it secretly for 25 years, in the shapes of explosions and the materials of buildings and the name of the city itself. The man who built it hated the merchandise and loved the ocean and hoped children would look more carefully at tide pools because of what he made. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.